Broadcasting from the dark corners of the earth, it's Tom Mordred's Midnight Radio. Well, it's been a while. I think the last thing I put out was immediately, of course.
Okay, it's fine. Clear your minds.
It's all right. We've just started. It's not interrupting the story at an inconvenient time. It's not undermining the tone just yet. Where do I start? I guess this is a bit of a unusual Midnight Radio, or at least a little different from the Midnight Radios we usually do. Tonight's Midnight Radio will be in support of Bad Crew Theater's Indiegogo for their production of Dead Romance. And I have just realized that all the stream information is wrong. So we're going to take a moment to fix all of that. Dead Romance. Though I should play Lost in Vivo again. I was enjoying Lost in Vivo. Lost in Vivo is a good scary game. Reading. I guess reading fun. Done. And you know what? All of those tags are good. All right, I'm just going to make sure I'm comfortable, because once I lock in, we're going to be here for a while. Now, I don't know exactly how long Dead Romance is, but I guess a little background for anyone who's unfamiliar who might be listening to this now. Oh, and if you're listening to this on YouTube, it's entirely likely that the Indiegogo is now long over, so you can absolve yourself of any guilt of that. But I might put this out the same week, but even then, it'll only be going for a few days. So if you can help us, please do. My version of Dead Romance that I'm going to be reading tonight is actually a republished version of what do you call it? Mad Norwegian, of Dead Romance by Mad Norwegian Press. This was done in 2005, and Lawrence Miles, the author, actually revised Dead Romance and made a few changes that he felt were appropriate. So if you have an older version of Dead Romance, in case you're reading along, but I doubt you are, in case you have an older version of Dead Romance, this is the 2005 version, which also included a few extra stories, but. Will I read the artist's foreword? Why not? Why not? It feels appropriate, so I think that's what we're going to do. Or I could just get into it, though. How long is the introduction? Never mind, the introduction's too long. Sorry, Larry. Babylon 5. I don't know if Miles liked Babylon 5. I love Babylon 5. Yeah, here we are. I will read oh. I don't know if that's picking up on the mic. I live in a tiny apartment, so you will get a few extra sounds. I'll read you the last little bit, I guess. Let's see. I'll read the last paragraph just for the sake of it. I'm curious, though. This is the first time I've had the opportunity to write a proper foreword to a book. The first time something I've written has been published in a way that demands some kind of explanation. I was imagining that when I came to it, I'd be witty, personal, and vaguely acerbic. Instead, looking back at what I've said, I seem almost disinterested. It's almost like literary criticism than personal reflection, as if I'm writing a commentary on a novel whose author has already died. Possibly I should have expected that. It's only been half a decade since the book was first published, but already, very little of the person who wrote it seems to be left. It is, in a sense, like finding something you wrote when you were a kid. So now, I'm going to leave you in the hands of someone else entirely. Someone younger and thinner, who never wore a beard and who thinks he's a girl. Lawrence Miles, March 2004. First notebook, 128 pages. Notes on a prologue. 1. Alright, let's start with the basics and see where we can go from there. This book is called Dead Romance. That's what I'm going to put on the cover anyways. Although, it wasn't the first name I thought of. I was going to call it Living Space, but then it'd have space in the title, and you might expect it to be about little bubble-headed rocket men, like you used to see on the covers of those old sci-fi magazines before everyone started dropping acid and seeing Starchilds everywhere. I did think about calling it Real Life, but then you'd probably want me to tell you exactly what real life is sometime before the end, and let's face it, it's not going to happen. So Dead Romance it is. Not the most exciting title in the world, but it means something to me. And I'm the important one, seeing as nobody else is ever going to read this. I think the word for what I'm doing is therapy. It'd be nice to think that someday the archaeologists are going to be digging up these notebooks and treating them like important historical documents, or even like holy scriptures from a lost civilization. To be honest, though, I don't think the next people who come here are going to care much about English literature. The first thing I'd better do is invent my audience. I'll pretend there are thousands of you out there, and I'll pretend you're all like me. Young, smart, pretty, and sarcastic. NB, I'm probably being ironic here, although I'm not really sure anymore. Just so we've got some common ground, I'll pretend you were born sometime in the late 1940s. Nope, sod that. I'll pretend you were born on the 15th of August, 1948. All of you. Well, why not? If you're going to invent an audience, why not invent one in your own image? 2. I've never written a book before. Come to think of it, I've never met anyone who's written a book either. Even though I've spent most of the last 5 years of my life hanging around with people who think they're artists. Or at least people who think they're the kind of people who'd be close friends of Oscar Wilde if they were born nearly 100 years earlier. Thought they were the kind of people who would be close friends of Oscar Wilde. Past tense. Must remember that. In fact, the only person I ever knew who came close to the world of publishing was Dorian. 3 years ago, in the summer of '68, Dorian suddenly decided to tell everybody that he was one of the great modern poets of our time, on the grounds that he'd been to university and had an ode to some South American revolutionary or other published in the student magazine. So, in the year when the rest of us were all pretending to hate pop music and claiming to be deeply, deeply into jazz, Dorian spent most of his time hanging around cafes in Covent Garden, standing on tables and reading out poetry to anyone who'd listen until the waitress came and told him to stop. At which point he'd tell them that they were just pawns in an imperialist conspiracy to stifle freedom of expression. They'd tell him to piss off, and Dorian would forgive them in an act of Christ-like benevolence. So there. 3. At this point, I'd just like to say that I'm writing all of this from memory. I'm not making any guarantees that these memories are accurate, alright? 4. The reason I mentioned Dorian is that he did get a book published, although it was just a collection of his stupid poems. He spent about 6 months telling us how a major, and I mean, major, publishing house had picked up on his work and was going to unleash it on an unsuspecting world in early '69, when he finally showed up one day carrying 24 author's copies in a Tesco bag, and they were all held together with staples, and the ink came off your fingers whenever you touched them. We decided that these author's copies were probably the only copies in existence, but we never said anything. Not even when Dorian tried to sell them off. He managed to unload a couple onto tourists, but the rest ended up getting stuffed under his bed, where they stayed for almost 2 years, until they were, presumably, destroyed along with the rest of London. So what's more pathetic? Me or Dorian? After all, at least 2 other people got to read his masterwork, even if neither of them could speak English properly. I'm telling myself this is therapy, but who's to say what Dorian did wasn't? In the same end, I'm writing this for the same reasons he wrote his poem. Because everyone likes to imagine they're the center of attention, even when they're talking to themselves. 5. Anyways, those basics I was talking about. First, the world ended on October 12th, 1970. That wasn't the final end, of course. Not the very last day. Most of the property damage was after that. The big cities, the Tokyos and the Berlins and the Riyadhs, they didn't get torn out of the ground until a few days later. But the 12th of October was when it all started. Note how I put the "it" in italics so that you know how big and scary it was. Just you wait, I'll be underlining things next. I was in London when the end came, which makes me unique, I should think. I don't suppose anyone else from my neighborhood is still alive by now. Nobody human, anyways. London. Let me tell you about London. 6. London was the capital of England, which was a country that liked to tell itself it was the cultural heart of the whole world on the grounds that it had invented all the things that were great, like Shakespeare and the British Broadcasting Corporation, and even the Beatles, who came from Liverpool, which was a small suburb of London, according to all the tourist guides. In 1970, there were about 7.5 million people in London, although I think most of them would have liked to be somewhere warmer. What was it like? Well, there were gutters stuffed full of last night's chip wrappers, and there were roads packed with taxis, driven around by men with bad complexions who stank of cheap cigarettes. Everything stank of cheap cigarettes, because the adults smoked and the children collected cigarette cards that turned their fingers the same color as dead newspapers. There were streets full of people who complained when nobody was listening and who shut up again whenever anybody was. People who said the government should bring back national service. People who wanted something Ted Heath couldn't give them, even though they couldn't remember what. There were pensioners wherever you looked, talking about the war and drooling onto the pavement. Yes, I know it's cruel, but I was only 22, so I had the right to take the piss out of old people whenever I felt like it. It was a dull, wet, bleach down the walls kind of city that tasted like grease or closed down cafeterias. And I hope that's given you a good feel for the place, because it's taken me hours to get this part right. That wasn't the city where we lived, though. Me and Cal and Dorian and all the others, we didn't live in London. We lived in London. London was different. London was the place you heard about in all the Sunday papers. The place you saw every time you watched the news on the BBC and heard the posh presenters talking about the latest fashions of today's youth. The place that was famous all over the world for being the city that had invented everything new and shiny and exciting from Carnaby Street to the Beatles. And if there are any Americans left alive, they probably still think Ringo Starr was a Cockney. If any human beings ever crawl out of the wreckage to restart their civilization, I hope to God they dig an idol of Ringo out of the ruins and worship him as their messiah, because it'd be kind of fitting. Oh yes, it was London for us, all right. We ignored the soggy people, we ignored the soggy food, we ignored the dog shit on the streets and the germs in the underground. In fact, I'm not really sure what we didn't ignore. I don't know what we thought London actually was. Half a dozen shops on Oxford Street and a jazz club in Soho, probably. 7. Another good reason for not calling this book real life, 6 pages in, and it sounds like a bad joke already. So this was the way things were in the last few months before the end. It was, according to the hippies, the dawning of the age of something or other, and we were never, ever hippies. We thought we were much too sophisticated and bohemian for that kind of thing. Which meant it was a good time for putting things into your body that weren't supposed to be there, basically. Sex? There was plenty of sex, most of it in dingy little cafe back rooms, although we heard orgies were supposed to be fashionable in the Rolling Stone high society. I'm trying to imagine getting into an orgy with the people I used to live with, but I don't think I can do it without making myself sick. Drugs? Obviously. Although all the boys used to lie about the number of trips they'd had, the same way they used to lie about the number of women they slept with. There was a kind of subspecies of girl in WC2 that had been specially bred by the boys in the LCD crowd, just so they'd have someone to offload all their post-beatnik bullshit onto. Girls who'd take as many tabs of acid as they were told to take, and then lie down with their eyes and legs wide open, with big, stupid, I-can-see-through-time smiles on their faces. Girls like that must be extinct now, I suppose. I wonder what happened to them when it came to the world. They must have just stood there, staring at it as it flooded into the city, smiling and giggling and... No. Now I'm just fantasizing. 8. I hope you got the message by now. I am not, repeat, not, the kind of woman who's likely to drop one tab of acid and end up staring at the carpet for 6 hours, looking for the hidden Jesus faces in the pattern. Which is important, because of what I'm going to tell you next. What I'm going to tell you next is that at 11 o'clock p.m., on the 27th of September, 1970, I wouldn't have been able to tell you who I was, where I had come from, or why I even bothered getting up in the mornings. And the first thing I can remember about the night is being stuffed into the back of a police car. I can only remember that much because of the smell. Police cars used to smell like no other car on Earth, like everyone who'd ever been arrested had left sweat marks on the upholstery. I was lying on my side, on the back seat, with the weight of 2 police officers, neither of them women, pressing my face down into whatever it was police car seats had instead of leather. The reason the policemen were sitting on me was that I was trying to throw myself out the rear door of the car. This wasn't a good idea, seeing as the car must have been swerving along the Strand at the time, but what can you expect? Logic? I was screaming like a baby, kicking my skinny little legs, probably shouting, "Get off, you fascist bastard scum!" or something. Full-on paranoia. Full-on bad trip. Which was kind of surprising, seeing as I hadn't taken any acid, but we'll come to that later. 9. I was sane again by the time I got to the station. Sane and miserable. Just some skinny, badly dressed dropout girl with spit dribbling down her chin, staring at her plimsolls like a 6-year-old. The desk sergeant was a big, square-faced man with whale meat for skin, and he looked like he'd been molded that way. One of those people who get stuck in a dead-end job for so long that they end up changing shape to fit the office furniture better. You could just tell, that he'd gone into the police force because he'd expected it to be exciting. He'd probably seen Z-Cars when he'd been a teenager and thought, that's the job for me. Poor sod. Judging by the look on his face, I must have been the 8th million burden on society who'd been pushed in front of him that week. "Naeem," he said. "Christine," I told him. I tried to sound sorry about it. "Christine what?" he asked. He said it like it was a question on an official form, like everyone who came to the station got asked, "Christine what?" I said. "Summerfield," I said. I felt stupid saying it out loud for some reason. Like I'd only just decided to be Christine Summerfield, and still didn't really believe it yet. Then the arresting, meaning sitting on, officers gave him all the facts. Apparently, and I had to believe this, seeing as I didn't remember any of it, I'd been found hanging around a building site near the embankment, in the middle of a space that was going to grow up to be an office block one day. According to the official report, I'd been walking around in circles and making gurgling noises in the dark. One of the officers told the desk sergeant that my pupils had been dilated, so as far as he was concerned, I had to be on drugs. Fact. Whenever the police arrest someone on a drugs charge, they always said the victim's pupils were dilated, even though most of the force didn't even know what dilated meant. I tried to tell them. I tried to tell them I wasn't on drugs at all, that I was actually having a nervous breakdown, that I was suffering from stress, and that my family had a long history of manic depression, but they weren't interested. Besides, it was a lie anyways. Ten. It's only just struck me. What I told you about London earlier on, it doesn't make sense, does it? We used to say we're living inside a pop culture capital of the world, where all the boys and girls were in rock and roll bands, and where all the boys were in rock and roll bands, and all the girls had Union Jack knickers. We used to say our city was the hippest place on earth, but it's now London. London doesn't exist anymore. That I've spotted the big lie. London wanted to be great by being just like New York. It's true, isn't it? We'd all read those stories about Greenwich Village and the NME, and we thought we could be exactly like that. Like a little community of artists and dropouts protesting against the establishment. The actual establishment, not the club. By doing fuck all with our lives. Let's face it, even Dorian's useless poems were just bad Bob Dylan lyrics in a Hampstead accent. We thought we were part of the best make-believe city on earth, because we were English, and we were Londoners, and we were great. But we were trying to prove how great we were by being New Yorkers. Why didn't I spot that before? 11. Alright. Seeing as I've started talking about America, I might as well go all the way and tell you exactly what happened to London in 1970. Excuse me. Tell you exactly what was happening to London in 1970, because this is where things get all twisted and sinister, and it's pretty much down to one man plus a few of his friends, because this was the year of Mr. Charles Mills Manson. We did some of the most embarrassing things on Earth in the last couple years before the end. Just before we'd found out that we could. The stupid clothes, the stupid sex, the stupid drugs, the stupid everything. It was the dawning of the age of whatever I said before, and we wanted to live in dirty, stinking communes wearing no clothes and writing love letters to the Dalai Lama, and then that's what we'd do. Even the TV programs that were supposed to be in black and white had gone psychedelic on us. The Californians were telling us that this was the whole new step in mankind's evolution, that we were turning into a new kind of superspecies, a race so advanced it could stare at pink and green wallpaper for hours on end without freaking out. Everywhere we looked, the music, papers, the record sleeves, the boutiques, because, let's be honest, those were the only places we ever did look, the message was the same. We weren't sure what the message was, but it had something to do with tomorrow being a better day, probably. Manson changed all that. Like all the other important icons in our lives, he was an American. He looked like a guru. He had a big black Jesus beard, and he lived on a ranch somewhere in the West Coast, where he built up a whole family of followers until he had what people like to call a cult. And let's face it, on the surface, he wasn't that different from the rest of us. If we'd had a ranch of our own, and then we'd have hung around taking drugs and getting naked as well, or at least that's what we'd like to tell each other we'd do. But we were still pretending that a ground floor flat off Endell Street could be the HQ for some kind of revolutionary social movement, so what did we know? In August of 1969, a bunch of 5 nearly famous people in Hollywood all got killed off in one night. And at the time, everyone said it was down to one of those American guerrilla groups that we always used to get excited about. Like the Weathermen or the Black Panthers. A few months later, the papers told us all about Charles Manson, who was exactly like the kind of supercharged, super hip personality we all looked up to, but who'd ordered his family to hack people to bits for no good reason at all. 12. Everyone felt a bit down after that. It wasn't just us. Me and Cal and all the others. The whole of London, which, let's not forget, wanted to think of it as a major, and I mean, major American city, felt it. Suddenly, all the big acid-colored shop fronts and the smiley face badges were starting to look, well, I can't think of a better word, so let's just say sick. Manson finally went on trial in 1970. By that time, we were still pretending to be the beautiful people, but none of us were talking about turning into higher beings anymore. We weren't talking about LSD much either. Cocaine? Yes. LSD? No. In 1970, London wasn't dayglow, it was turning brown. Brown and orange. In a way, maybe it's a good thing that the world ended when it did. The 1970s would have been too ugly to live through. Or is that in bad taste, saying a thing like that? In Covent Garden, there used to be a big piece of graffiti on the side of Keene Street Library, which had been there ever since late '68, and it said in huge, psychedelic green letters, "Give peace a chance." Then sometime in early 1970, someone wrote a second message underneath it in no-nonsense black. The second message said, "No." As far as the beautiful people were concerned, the writing was on the wall, if you see what I mean. 13. Incidentally, Charles Manson's trial never ended. Events got in the way, really. I should think he's dead now, or turned into something less human than he was to start with. The trial started in July 1970, and we all followed it in the papers. The prosecution lawyer was a man called Vincent Bugliosi, which is something I remember without having to look it up, because at the time I thought it was exactly the kind of name a big American lawyer should have. Vincent Bugliosi told the whole world about the helter-skelter, about how Manson and his followers wanted to kickstart the revolution, and none of us back in London, it didn't feel like London that day, knew where to look. We felt like we'd been helped, I think. We didn't exactly feel guilty, but we were all on coke by then, so it didn't take long for the paranoia to kick in. We were paranoid about getting blamed, about the CIA sending agents to England to round us all up and have us all shot. I remember everyone, not just us in the flat, reading parts about the apocalypse at the end of the Bible just to see if there really were secret messages in them, like Manson was supposed to have said. Especially in September. In September, there were 2 or 3 big plane hijacks in some Arab country or another, so of course everyone was finding Bible prophecies about winged things causing death and destruction in the Holy Land. Then the papers started talking about the risk of a Manson-style families coming to England, and people started turning up dead, even in London, but I'll get to that later. Wouldn't it be funny if it turned out that Manson was innocent all along? If his defense had been planning on pulling out some breathtaking piece of evidence at the last minute, proving that everything had been a terrible mistake and saving him from the electric chair? Well, it might have happened. We'll never know now. 14. I just pulled a scrapbook out of my rucksack, and something fell out from the inside back cover when I did. It's a newspaper. A whole one. Not just a clipping. The Daily Mirror, dated the 12th of October, 1970. I'd forgotten all about that. There weren't many of them printed, and I picked one up the morning after the end, just because I was one of the few human beings in London who had time to think about things like that. I should think that most of Fleet Street stopped existing just after the first few issues came off the presses. There's no story on the cover, but there's a great big photograph and a great big headline. The end of the world must have been a real hold-the-front-page kind of event, and the journalists couldn't have had much time to rewrite the issue, so the pages inside are full of snippets they already had lined up. Things so stupid and trivial, it's almost funny reading them now. Only page 2 says anything about the lead story, and it was obviously written by people who didn't know what was going on. But I like the front page. There's a photo of the sky over London taken just after it's split open. The picture isn't great, probably because the cameraman was somewhere around Holborn, which was much too close to the center of the action to get a good view of it all. But you can make out the basics. The shapes, the shadows, the hole in the world. It's the headline I like, though. Well, what would you write if you had to come up with a headline for the last day of your planet? The editors of the Mirror decided to try summoning up what they used to call Old Dunkirk Spirit, which was named after a battle in World War II that the British lost horribly, I think. The idea of the headline was to tell the people of the world, however bad things got, there was always a chance of living through it. The headline, which doesn't look like it's got anything at all to do with the photo underneath it, is this: Never give up. "15. Oh, the irony. I've just realized why I like that headline so much. Because it sums up this whole story. Or rather, it sums up what this whole story isn't. This is a story about giving up. Giving up your life. Giving up your world. Giving up on everything you've ever had. Am I being too pessimistic here? Well, I don't have anything to prove. There's nothing clever about coming up with a tragic ending just because you want it to look laid back and cynical. But we already know what the ending is, don't we? The Dunkirk spirit. Never give up. Not even if you know your whole planet's finished. Is that a moral, do you think? Maybe. We'll see. For now, let's get back to the police station. Notes on the station. 16. Ending up in a police cell was a whole new experience for me. I wasn't naturally the kind of person to get in trouble, which is kind of ironic, bearing in mind what was happening to me in the last couple of months before the end. Or what I remember happening anyways. I'd been on LSD, and I was still on the hash, who wasn't, but that didn't count. You didn't get arrested for that. Not usually. If it gives you some idea of the kind of law-abiding citizen we're talking about here, for law-abiding citizen, read someone too scared to do anything much in a public place, try for this size. After the graffiti on Keene Street got changed, I found another Dayglow message. This time outside of the queer toilets in Leicester Square. The graffiti was probably the work of that person who'd scrawled, "Give peace a chance" slogan, and it said, "All you need is love." I came up with my own side-splitting reply to this. I even went as far as buying the spray can so I could add the words, "and a few basic proteins." But I didn't. I got as far as the entrance to the square, then bottled out. Can you imagine that? One of the crowd who wanted to overthrow the fascist machine that controlled the free-thinking people of the world, and I was too scared to even add a couple of words to some graffiti that was already there. That's so pathetic, even I'm impressed. So how I had ended up in the middle of this building site, bawling my head off? What had pushed me over the edge into screaming bloody delirium to the point where I couldn't have cared less who was listening or how many panda cars there might have been in the area? Well, if you'd asked me that night, I'd have told you the answer was simple. It was the cocaine. 17. I won't go into details. I won't bother. Back in the late 60s, oh yes, all those long, long months ago, the shops were full of books about drugs, about drug subcultures, and how drugs would turn people into supermen, but never superwomen, funnily enough, and how any number of happy little journalists had taken peyote on the side of a mountain and suddenly turned into American Indian shamans. I'm only mentioning this because it might turn out to be important to the story. Possibly. Cocaine doesn't make you see things. It doesn't make you want to fly, either. I'm telling you this because, according to the newspapers, all drugs make you want to jump out of a high-rise window. But if you're under stress, if you're in the right frame of mind, then maybe, just maybe, a couple lines of coke are going to be enough to push you to take that one step further. Enough to make you decide that all the things you've been brought up with your life are worth next to nothing. Enough to make you drop all your defenses and get you crying like a baby. Like something in you suddenly breaks open and makes you realize how hard it's been pretending to be a living, thinking, grown-up human being all these years. The same kind of shock you get when you realize that nobody's really listening when you talk to yourself, even if you think you're being really witty and clever. Nobody cares, and nobody's there to hear you. Is that the reason I ended up in the cell? Well, what do you think? 18. There was another woman in the cell with me. There was plenty of empty cells at Charing Cross police station, so I don't know why they made me share. Cal used to say it was some kind of policeman game, like when school children play with conkers. The police hang around the cells, putting bets on which of the prisoners is going to end up with the top bunk, then moving the winner to another cell when there's an even harder case to deal with. You get the idea. I don't remember much about the way the woman looked. I remember her wearing lots of black and having a lot of pockets. She was probably overweight. All I remember for sure is that she'd been taken in for some kind of theft. She kept telling me over and over again how she'd been arrested, but the details changed every time, like the story was evolving inside of her until it was just the right shape to fit into my head properly. "There's so much stuff in the world," the woman said, more than once. "You wouldn't think they'd care, you know? You wouldn't think they'd care how much of it I've got in my pockets." She isn't important to the story, but I think about her a lot these days. Like Cal and Charles Manson and all the others. I wonder what happened when it came and turned her into just another piece of stuff in the world. I think I'm overemphasizing the it here. Let's move on. 19. 20. I'm sitting in the middle of some ruins as I write this, although I'm not sure what they're ruins of. I'm a long way from London now, but I brought some things with me when I came here. To remind me of home? I don't think so. I don't think I care enough anymore. One of the things I brought is the scrapbook. It belonged to someone who used to be my boyfriend, and he let me have it when the end came, on the grounds that he was never going to find any use for it once he'd left Earth. There's a cutting from the London Evening Standard on the first page. The headline reads, "The most grotesque trial of the 20th century." There's a big picture of Charles Manson in the middle of the text, staring up at God in the ceiling and trying his best to look like Christ. There are more clippings like that from the Manson trial after that, most of them taken from the London papers. Then after a while things change. There's a piece from another copy of the Standard, dated the 1st of September, a front-page piece, this time with the headline, "Cults in London, warn police," which isn't the most respectful headline ever, seeing as the story's about a murder. I won't bother copying out the text, although the details are pretty straightforward. Girl, aged about 20, found dead near Constitution Hill, face slashed, hands slashed. No identifying features left. The police are calling the murder ritualistic, an idea that obviously gets the reporters excited. Suddenly the story, "Girl found dead," turns into, "Look out, Charles Manson's bunch have got to England." The Standard starts warning everybody that this could be the work of a cult, even though there's not one shred, oh, nice word, very tasteful, of evidence. More front-page stories after that. A second murder, 2 weeks after the first one. Same MO, like they used to say on Dragnet. And the same kind of weapon. As far as the papers are concerned, 2 deaths is a crime wave, so the conclusion's simple. There really is a cult at work on the streets of London. Forget the fact that the Manson family never bothered with the ritual killing. Let me try that again. Excuse me. Forget the fact that the Manson family never bothered with ritual killing, whatever that's supposed to mean. Forget the fact that Charlie himself is up in court in LA, denying he's got any interest in black magic at all. This is obviously the work of some kind of Satan worshipper, like in Rosemary's Baby. Maybe, say the papers, this is the real reason why nobody's reported the dead girls missing. Maybe they were both members of cults who'd cut off all connections with their real families. You're probably wondering whether I was scared that September. Being a woman in her early 20s, with the same kind of build as the two victims, they were both size 9, one bigger than the size I told everyone I was. Wasn't I paranoid, walking through London on my own? Don't be stupid. There were 3.5 million women in London, for God's sake. How was I supposed to know I'd be the next in line? 21. Wait a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself. 22. Also, I've just remembered who made Rosemary's Baby. Is that in bad taste, do you think? 23. I didn't spend more than an hour in the police cell before the big squarehead desk sergeant came to let me out. Squarehead! Do you remember that old comic book hero we used to have in England who fought in World War II with Germans? In World War II and called the Germans squareheads? See how all authority figures ended up looking like Nazis in my world? To be honest, I don't think the police could be bothered charging me. They must have guessed I was on something. And I suppose they had blood and urine tests that could have told them what, but why bother messing around with a girl's urine if there isn't a major crime involved? But there was another reason they let me go, and it's this. They had better things to think about. I found that out when the sergeant led me back to the main desk, down the big sweaty corridors that joined all the cells together. I kept my eyes fixed on my plimsolls while I shuffled along by his side, still feeling kind of embarrassed about ending up here. We were halfway down the corridor when I heard the noise from the front desk. Men grunting, furniture being shoved around. I'd been hanging around in South London pubs since I was too young to legally be there. Too young to legally be in South London, I should think. And you didn't have to tell me what a fist fight sounded like. The sound of men trying to out-tough each other by pushing chairs over. The sergeant didn't speed up when he heard it. I got the feeling he was happy to let the other policemen deal with the problem, whatever it was. "We got the fucker," he told me. "Nah," I said. That was me trying to sound interested. It took me a while to figure out what he meant by that. Like I said, you could tell he'd had it with his job. You could tell he'd have given anything to go after real criminals for a change, instead of having to process a scrawny little cokeheads going in and out of his station. So there was only one person that the fucker could have been. After all, how often was there a celebrity killer on the loose in that part of London? 24. I've seen the police report on the subject who was brought into the station that night. The man who was arrested in connection with the two murders around Constitution Hill and Regent's Park. Obviously, I didn't see the report at the time, but I was shown it later on, after. Well, we'll come to that. The report says that around 11:45 on the 27th of September, a group, of 3 police officers spotted a man behaving suspiciously in the embankment area not far from the building site where they'd found me drooling in the rubble. The suspect looked like he was searching the streets for something, although when the police questioned him, he wouldn't say what. When the police officers pressed the point, the man got aggressive and had to be restrained. When he was searched, he was found to be, and note the quote marks, carrying several electronic components of uncertain manufacture. The officers took this as evidence that the man was mental. There was a reason for this. In the early days of the trial, some of the Mansons' would-be disciples in California had started saying that their guru was transmitting instructions to them whenever he was on TV, using some kind of special hippie radio technology that only the children of the revolution could understand properly. Ever since then, there'd been stories about deadheads walking around with radio parts strapped to their ears so they could hear any messages that might have been sent by whatever icons they believed in. And when it came to technology, the suspect on the embankment was loaded. He was carrying what looked like a weapon, as well. The report didn't exactly say what it was, but another quote, it had a sharp edge and could well have caused injuries consistent with the wounds from which the two victims died. In other words, as far as the police were concerned, they had the fucker. 25. And there he was, in the police station, being mauled at the front desk by his 3 arresting officers. I stopped looking at my feet when I got there, because if there's one thing you can't look away from, it's a fight. Yes, that was my first sight of him. I'm going to stop here for a few moments. I'm going to stop for a few moments thought here, because this is important. My first impression? He was powerful, for a start. Built. All 3 of the policemen were on top of him, pulling at his arms, trying to wrap themselves around his neck. Most of what I saw was blue, the color of the uniforms, and the same color of the suspect's suit. He was right in front of the desk, holding on the edge of it, to stop the officers dragging him off to the cells. One of the policemen dropped to the ground at about the time I came in, clutching his stomach, although you couldn't tell exactly who'd hit him, not while there were so many arms flying about all over the place. The other men were grunting and swearing, telling their victim to calm down, telling him it was no use struggling, telling him, "Christ, Jim, this is a sodding live one." There was nowhere he could go. The suspect wasn't listening. He was making a lot of noise as well, shouting over the grumbling sound the policemen were making. His teeth were clenched. You could tell. 26. "You've got to let me go," he was saying. Yes, whole sentences, so much more eloquent than the people who were attacking him, don't you think? "You don't understand. You've got to let me go." 27 to 28. I remember reading a book about Jack the Ripper when I was 15. A crap old paperback in the school library back in Manchester. The book had ended up in the library by accident, and I'd only read it because all the other kids said the pictures were really sick, so I thought I'd better take a look before the teachers figured everything out and took it away from us. I can't remember what the book was called. I remember the point, though. The writer said he was sure that Jack the Ripper was the leader of some black magic cult or other. The murderers were part of a ritual, meant to call forth devils and so on, and that's why Jack took the wombs out of some of his victims, because wombs are an important part of the ceremony, apparently. The writer talked about the ceremony a lot, although it sounded to me like he'd made the details up off the top of his head. More therapy writing, maybe. The pictures were sick, like everyone said. There was a police photo, the one they took of the last murder scene back in the 1880s. There was a woman sprawled out on a bed, but she'd been pretty much turned into dog food. Parts of her body had been hacked off, and her head had been ripped up until you could see her face, and her face had been ripped up until all you could see of her face was a big grey smudge. And this was, according to the caption, something that had been a walking, talking human being just one day before the photo had been taken. You had to laugh. I mean, not at the photo. You had to laugh at the idea that the kind of person who'd done this was some kind of voodoo magician. The idea that he'd planned this out as part of a plot to call up whatever ghost he was supposed to believe in. I keep thinking about the murderers who were around when I was younger. The ones whose faces kept turning up on the BBC for months after they were caught. Men like John Christie. Scrawny, wrinkly little men with ugly glasses and too many personal problems. Would anyone ever have written about them as being magicians? But the rules were different if you were talking about things that happened 100 years ago. Why? Because there's something about that point in time, the way you see it in all the Hammer horror movies, that makes you believe things might have been different then, that there really could have been bad magic in the middle of London. The 1970 was the same. Probably only the second time in the city's history when people could think there were devil worshippers on the move. It was like the killer had been born out of all the dead skin left over from the 60s, like those two women had been killed by the culture instead of by a mad bastard with a knife. By the way, if you think I'm starting to sound cynical, let's not forget, you've been talking to someone who must have been to a couple of dozen different planets by now, and not just in the marijuana and astral projection way. You're talking to someone who spent her last days in London sharing a flat with a spaceman. Someone who's held a whole universe in her hands, a whole miniature universe squeezed into a tiny magic bottle. Once you've seen all the little galaxies spinning around between your fingers, you start to get different ideas about what it means to be realistic. That's all I'm saying. 29:30. Where was I? Let me look. Oh yes, the man in the police station, with all the blue uniforms around him. Just for a second, the policeman backed off, enough to let me see the suspect from head to foot. He was tall, although obviously he was buckled up, so he'd obviously been kicked about by the policeman even before he'd arrived. He was thin, but not sick thin. There were big knots of muscle under his suit. You could see. A suit! And since when did mass murderers wear suits, anyways? I could see his face, all pale and covered in bulging veins, with big, scary teeth between his lips. I could see hair, short blonde hair, sticking up in little prickles all over his head. What else? Oh, a little gold earring, just a stud. His face was so twisted up, there was no way of saying how old he was, but you could tell he was young, just by the earring. Young, or a bit on the Leicester Square side. The next thing I knew, someone was prodding me in the back. The desk sergeant. We were still standing at the end of the cell corridors, just spectating. Go on, the sergeant told me. Sod off. I didn't argue. I headed for the doors between all the chairs that had been scattered across the floor in the fight. You've got to let me go, the suspect kept shouting. It's going to happen again. There's going to be another killing. You've got to let me go. You notice the emphasis I put on that word, go. Why? Because on that word, the blonde man decided to use what must have been the last of his strength and make a break for it. I didn't even know it was happening, seeing as I was only watching out of one eye and trying not to trip over any of the chairs. Coming down from the coke, yes, but still not exactly light on my feet. There were yelps from the policeman, a grunt of something like, "Get the bastard!" That's when I turned to look at the desk full on. That's when I saw the face of the blonde man hurling towards me. Just the face. At that exact moment, the rest of the body didn't matter much. Just the face, the teeth, the earring, then the hand. There were fingers reaching for me. Not going for the throat, though. It was more like he was reaching out for help. I didn't even jump. I could feel the tips of his fingers brushing against my face. "Please," he said. He didn't say anything else. He couldn't. Not with the first of the policemen getting an arm around his throat, the second one pulling his elbows behind his back, and the third getting up off the floor and swearing at him. And me? I just stood there, staring like an idiot, watching him being punched in the stomach and dragged to the ground. Then the desk sergeant told me to sod off again. I did. 31. This is the kind of story that used to get you on chat shows, or at the very least got you in the column inches in News of the World. How I was the first woman to stare into the face of the butcher of Buckingham Palace and live. The first killing hadn't actually been anywhere near Buckingham Palace, of course, but Constitution Hill was close enough for the papers. You can just see my story, sitting there, on page 4 underneath the topical cartoon. How the killer reached out and touched me with hands that had been rummaging through God knows what kind of offal. So I'd like to be able to say that I was shocked or stunned, or that the experience made me understand how brief and fragile life on Earth could be. It didn't, though. In fact, the only thought that went through my head when his fingers brushed against me was this. Wow. Which probably isn't the right reaction, ethically speaking. So you might think that it was some kind of cosmic karma, that less than an hour later it happened that less than an hour later after it happened, someone tried to kill me. 32. I've been wondering recently what London must have been like these days. What London must be like these days. It can't all have been destroyed, can it? The intelligence that runs the city now is, well, intelligent, cultured. I can't imagine I can't imagine the new ownership clearing away the ruins under the rubble any more than I can imagine Lady Diamond clearing her shelves. And yes, I'll explain that in a minute. The ruins were still there on the day I walked out of the city, anyway. So this is how I see London now. I imagine a whole part of the city that's been walled off and left intact, or at least as intact as the last time I saw it. I imagine the Houses of Parliament with their towers broken off, and St. Paul's Cathedral cracked open like an egg. I imagine all the cars that were in the capital piled on top of one another in the wreckage of Leicester Square, set alight and turned into a bonfire that never goes out. I imagine a sky that's the color of smoke, where the air's been burning for so long that it's been stained brown forever. And then what happens is this. The spectators let humans loose in the ruins inside the walled-off battlefield. They've chosen the humans carefully, these spectators. They've picked all the big icons, all the best madmen we ever came up with, but the icons have been pumped up with drugs and machines that make them pretty much indestructible. They come from all over the world, the way I imagine it. I can see Chairman Mao, and Ian Brady, and John Christie, yes, all right, Charles Manson, stalking the streets with knives in their hands and spit all over their clothes. The spectators start placing bets, trying to guess who will be the last man standing. Even the dead get a chance to play. Even Jack the Ripper might turn up to be a special guest star. When only one of the humans is left, the spectators settle the bets and start the game again, bringing the bodies back to life and patching up the holes. Icon soldiers in a fight that never ends. Let's be honest. It's not much different from the way we did things when we still ran the world. It's just more direct, that's all. This is the way I imagine things. I've got no way of knowing if any of it might be true. Anyway, back to the 27th of September. Or rather, the early hours of the 28th. Alright, listeners, we've been going for about an hour now. I'm going to take a short break, moisten my vocal cords, and also I'm going to start recording, because I've just realized that I haven't been recording this whole time. So relax for a hot minute, and I will be back in just a moment. And we are back. I'll take a moment just to let everyone get settled again, just in case, people are out in the washroom. What's wrong with me? I can't do words. So this next section is called Notes on Lady Diamond's Shop. Now, I mentioned earlier, and as you can see with the little QR code there on the stream, we're doing a stage adaptation of Dead Romance. And while developing the script, I was gutted to discover and learn that we had to cut Lady Diamond. Lady Diamond is a wonderful piece of texture, but unfortunately, she doesn't directly interact with the plot, and so we had to say goodbye to her. But I'm going to read this section about Lady Diamond just a moment. The ideal way for me to do Dead Romance would be like a 6-part mini-series. But even then I think about that, and I think, how would I translate most of Christine's confession to confession, therapy, notebook. How would that translate to screen? And I think it's really a testament to Larry Miles' writing that it's so difficult to adapt this story into anything, and still retain all of the weight and flavor it has. So if you're out there, Larry, thank you. I'm gonna take another sip of this Coke. Something nice and syrupy and caffeinated. Keep my throat nice and moist. Alright, let's get back into it. Notes on Lady Diamond's shop. 33. By now, the question you're asking yourself is, what was she doing, anyway? What was she doing coked out of her head in the middle of a building site at that time of night? If you'd asked me that at the time, I probably would have answered by staring at you. Blankly. Well, why shouldn't I have been there? That was the way we were, before the end. Me, Cal, and Dorian, and all the others. No job, no routine. Just starting my 4th year at an art college I'd only actually been to once. My family had only been middle class for a couple decades, in case you were wondering, and none of them had ever seen London. They didn't have a clue how higher education worked, which is why I could get away with telling them that it could take me up to 10 years to get my diploma, and why they kept sending me money for whatever it was the art students were supposed to need. Yes, it worked. Really. The point is, I didn't have any good reason to be anywhere. I was a goddess of the new Bohemian age, remember? No, the important thing wasn't where I'd been. It was where I was going to go next. Just think how I was feeling when I stepped out of that police station and into the freeze your tits off air of Charing Cross. Confused, coming down from a buzz, excited, seeing as I'd just come face to face with a man who'd probably end up being called the English Charles Manson, and most of all, itchy. The way I saw it, the police had gotten the way of what might have been a perfectly good cocaine experience. If you could ignore the screaming. What I needed was to find someone I knew, preferably someone with a good supply of their own, and tell them all about what had happened. How civilized. Darling, you wouldn't believe what I've been through. The police were positively everywhere. It was an absolute nightmare. And darling, what I saw when I was at the station... 34. Halfway along Henrietta Street in Covent Garden, there used to be a shop owned by a woman named Lady Diamond. Once upon a time, it had been a bookshop, but it had changed over the years until the windows were full of laughing Buddhas and psychedelic zodiac charts, while the glass in the doors was covered with little bits of card advertising palmistry and tarot reading sessions. I can't remember what the shop was called in 1970 because it changed every couple of weeks. It was probably Mystery or Secrets of the Light or something. Lady Diamond was her real name, by the way. Her family was the last great English colonials in India, and they'd come up with the title Diamond a couple of generations earlier to make it sound like they'd been in India as long as the rocks. I don't know why they'd called one of their daughters Lady, though. Maybe it was a social climbing kind of thing. Lady Diamond was the most accurate fortune-teller in the city, according to the woman herself. Anybody could make guesses, but she claimed that when she saw into the future, she always saw what was really there. She was even on the television once. A man from ITV came to her shop, asking her about the new resurgence in spiritualism or something. Lady went through her usual routine and ended up doing the reporter's horoscope for the entertainment of all the country. She told him he was destined for great things in broadcasting, which is kind of funny, because a couple of months later he was in a head-on car collision, lost the use of his legs, and had to retire from TVs. They didn't let cripples be celebrities back in England. They thought it looked cheap. Lady Diamond wasn't put out by that at all. "When I look into the future, I always see what's really there," she said when she'd heard about the crash. "But that doesn't mean I have to tell the truth about it." Right up until the last time I remember seeing her, she was still claiming her visions were 100% accurate. After all, as she kept telling her customers, she'd predicted the death of Bobby Fuller 2 weeks before it had happened and had personally tried to warn the man about it. Which was a pretty safe claim to make, seeing as Bobby Fuller himself wasn't going to be arguing with her. But by 1970, hardly anyone could remember who Bobby Fuller was. Until, in the end, all he was famous for, in London, was being the subject of Lady Diamond's most accurate prediction. 35. Bobby Fuller was an American rock and roll singer. He died in the mid-1960s when he tried flirting with a mafia don's girlfriend in a nightclub and ended up having his lungs pumped full of petrol by the don's bodyguards. 36-37. The reason Lady Diamond was so popular was she kept adding new ideas to her repertoire. When Buddhism was fashionable, she started using Buddhist chants in her readings. When the Beatles went to India, she painted Indian letters, or things that looked like Indian letters, anyway, on her tarot cards. When LSD was popular, and when wasn't it, her holy and guardian spirits turned into psychic aliens who were trying to speed up humankind's cosmic evolution. She kept throwing new bits and pieces into the window of the shop until it turned into a kind of jungle where natural selection could get on with its work as usual. The interesting looking religions ate up the boring ones, until all that was left was a kind of super faith, ready to chew up and spit out any other beliefs that ran into it. Laughing Buddha with pointy teeth and armor plating. Remember what I said about what London must look like now, with all the icons fighting in the ruins? Same principle. And as for the inside, the shop took up the bottom 2 levels of the building, but Lady had taken out the ceiling of the ground floor, something the council probably wouldn't have approved of, but there you go, to turn the place into a kind of a well, with the bookcases set along around the walls and the roof with the bookcases set all around the walls and the roof a long, long way overhead. The wall space above the bookcase was taken up by Lady's collection, leftovers from all the cultures she'd absorbed over the years, some of the items nailed to the brickwork and some of them resting on little shelves and balconies. There were animal skulls from India and Africa, with blotchy red glyphs painted right between their eyes. There were candles that never got lit, carved in the shapes of Chinese women in erotic poses. There were Victorian anatomical charts, telling you the best places to drill holes to cure people's madness. There was a grubby white robe that had been singed around the edges, which Lady claimed to have been worn by one of the men who'd burnt Joan of Arc. NB, obviously a lie. There was even the fetus of a kitten preserved in a jar, which should have looked pathetic and embarrassing, like that rock star in L.A. who had a jacket made out of donkey embryos. But somehow it looked right there in Lady's shop. And everywhere, whichever way you turned your head, there was a smell like dust and old grandfather clocks. Like Lady had sprayed the place with something to make it feel older than it was. The rule in the shop was this. When you went in, you didn't look up. If you looked up, your eyes tried to focus on the ceiling, but the ceiling was too far up for you to find. You just kept raising your head and raising it, taking in all the bones and charts and dead things until you started to feel dizzy. Like you were standing at the bottom of some kind of archaeological dig, looking at the centuries of history all pressed together. Most people gave up before they got as far as the roof. Then they had to sit down for a bit, usually on one of the big fat, karma-friendly beanbags that had been arranged in the middle of the floor. Clever Lady. She knew how to get people in the mood for business. She knew how to make you feel vulnerable. but the shop was supposed to be her home as well as her workplace, so it's kind of impressive that she had a crypt for a living room and still stayed pretty sane. 38. The shop was the first place I went after I left the police station, for a couple reasons. Firstly, it was close. Secondly, Lady was just the kind of person I wanted to tell about my run-in with the alleged, almost mass murderer. Seeing as I knew she'd have to pretend not to be impressed. She was getting on for twice my age, so there was always a lot of posing going on between us, and with her claiming to have once had tantric sex with Brian Wilson and everything. Thirdly, there was the cocaine. Just as a matter of course, Lady kept stashes of all the fashionable drugs in the shop, in case a client wanted a full-on head trip reading with all the 2001 special effects. She kept half a dozen Chinese puzzle boxes on the lower bookshelves, each one full of a different illegal substance. She knew she didn't have to worry about the police. Even if the Met felt like raiding the place, there wasn't a policeman alive who would bother messing with a Chinese puzzle box to get a hold of evidence. Cocaine again. Am I starting to sound like an addict? Maybe I'm just missing the comforts of my home. 39. The shop was closed when I got there. There weren't any lights on inside. That wasn't much of a setback. The front door might have been locked, but there was a rear door at the basement level behind Henrietta Street. The lock had been broken for months, and Lady had dealt with this by shoving a pile of old D.H. Lawrence paperbacks. Where did they come from? Up against the door. Anyone who was a friend of hers knew that all you had to do was give the door a big shove and send the copies of Sons and Lovers flying. I didn't have any problem with the idea of breaking into Lady's place. It's not like I was the only one doing it. Lady was famous? Notorious? For the number of skinny, hairy men she managed to end up in bed with, and most of her lovers and ex-lovers used the shop as a crash house sooner or later. Lady had forgotten who a lot of them were. They just ended up hanging around in the back rooms, spending their lives smoking dope and sleeping on old mattresses. She lost track of her partners, the way most people lose track of spare change. Dig your hands down the back of a sofa in Lady's place, and you were bound to find a hippie boy toy or two. I didn't see anyone in the back rooms when I broke in, although the light was on in the back passage, and there was the smell of cannabis and dead skin everywhere. I didn't bother poking my nose into any of the spare rooms. By that time, the need to finish off the evening's coke experience was a damn sight more important than the need to find Lady and tell her about the police station, so I headed straight up the stairs and into the main part of the shop. 4041. I'm thinking of starting a magazine. For people just like me. Seeing as I'm the only human survivor of London, I think, I'll be the only one who actually reads it. But that doesn't matter. The magazine's going to be called It Might Never Happen, the Journal of Mindless Optimism, and I'm going to fill it with all the things I tell myself to make me feel better about the world. I must have come up with millions over the last few months. All the way down from, at least I'm alive, to, it wasn't a very big planet anyway. What do you think I should make the cover story of the first issue, then? Should I go there with, there's always drugs, or should I just stick with the Dunkirk spirit? Anyways, it didn't take me long to crack the Coke puzzle box, because practice makes perfect, and on Henrietta Street you could always spot a user by the astonishing puzzle-solving skills he or she had picked up from hanging around in Lady's shop. In the end, I was disappointed. There was nothing there. A couple of empty paper wraps, and some white gunk in the corners of the box. Sure signs that someone had beaten me to it. So I did what I had to do. I started scraping the stuff out of the corners, using my fingers, my nails, and, when all else failed, the amazing suction power of my nose. I ended up squatting on one of those beanbags, tilting my head back with the box in front of my face, snuffling like a pig. Which wasn't a good idea. I turned the lights on when I'd walked into the room, and the lights were right up there in the ceiling, which meant that when I lay on my back and looked up, I could see all the dead things leering down at me, casting their big spiky shadows on the walls. I was staring straight at the animal skulls, things that had died in India and never been buried, covered in horns and hieroglyphs. There was the front part of some kind of lizard, mounted like the head of a moose, and yes, there was that inevitable fetal kitten. Don't look up. That was the first rule. The second rule was, especially not if you're on coke. Coke may not make you hallucinate, but it gets you paranoid enough to make you think that you're going to hallucinate, that the walls are going to start moving in on you any second, and there wasn't much in the box. But taking just one sniff was enough to remind me of all the times I'd taken more, and that was it. The trigger. The thing that made the paranoia kick in. All of a sudden I was staring into the eye sockets of a gazelle, waiting for it to move, or to blink, or to speak, or anything else that'd push me over the edge. Waiting for the lizard to crawl down from the wall with its hindquarters missing, waiting for the kitten to turn its head and look me in the eye. The gazelle, the lizard, the kitten, the dead bodies on the Victorian charts getting ready to bleed for me, Buddha smiling down from the print of some old Tibetan painting, grinning like death, psyching himself up to grab one of Lady Diamond's fake sacrificial daggers and say, "Fuck karma, let's all kill something." And then something moved. I didn't see it, but I heard it, and that was enough. Feet shuffling, a noise that could have been anything, someone clearing his throat, someone scratching an itch, anything, but that sounded, for just a moment, like the scampering of tiny feet. That was all it took, really. That one sound. Suddenly I was seeing movement out the corner of my eye, out the corners of both my eyes. The thing crawling across the walls, just out of vision, and then stopping, dead, whenever I turned to look at them. And I was pulling myself up off the floor, and yelling and stamping my feet, and clawing at the dead kitten that I was sure were clawing and sucking at me, crawling around under my t-shirt and nuzzling their way up my legs. At some point I must have realized I wasn't alone in the room. I must have figured out that I had company, even apart from the dead things. I'm not sure what the point was. 42. I just remembered something else about Lady Diamond. You know how I said earlier on that Dorian was the only other person I knew who, kind of, got a book published? Well, Lady Diamond used to write as well, although she never had anything in print, and she never tried to read any of her stuff to waitresses. In fact, nobody ever got to read the things she wrote, because she used to burn them as soon as they were finished. It was what Lady Diamond called sympathetic magic. It's like in those old black magic movies, when the voodoo man makes a little doll of someone, then starts mutilating it. The idea is that if you kill someone's image, part of that person dies as well. Lady used to say that there was no way you could do any real damage to someone with just a doll, because a doll wasn't detailed enough. Even if you made it look exactly like your victim, it didn't say anything about the kind of person the victim was, how the bad magic was supposed to know who to target out of all of the billions of people in the world. Lady Diamond had a solution to that. She used to write stories, but the lead characters in the stories were all based on real people. She'd make likenesses, just like voodoo men in the old movies did, but she did it with words instead of plasticine. She'd describe her victims in full, all the details of who they were and why she thought they had to suffer. At the end of each story, she'd make sure that something bad happened to them, which was, she said, just as good as sticking pins in a doll. Finally, Lady would burn the story in a little bowl, keeping the fire burning with little herbs and lighter fluid, filling the air with the scent of incense and cheap fiction. Sympathetic magic for literate people, she'd say. 43. I wonder sometimes if proper writers do that. If when publishers pay them to write books, they're actually being hired as assassins. Who can say? But it's funny, really. Here I am, writing out my first novel, and as it turns out, that the only other writers I've ever known also wrote things they knew nobody else would ever read. Why do we artistic types do these things? Is it really therapy, or are we just doing voodoo? Am I trying to change the way things happened by writing about them? By some kind of magic that only Lady Diamond would have understood properly? 44. There was a man standing in the doorway. The doorway between the main part of the shop and the stairwell, that is, so you could see the cannabis smoke wafting up the steps behind him. The bulb light was making little puffy clouds sparkle around his head. Looking back on things, I suppose it might have been him I'd heard moving up the stairs and into the room. This wasn't the way I saw it at the time, though. As far as I was concerned, he was probably in league with all the dead things. You can just see me there, can't you? Eyes open wide, lungs ready to burst with all the heavy breathing I've been doing, scummy bits of white powder dribbling down my lips, clothing a mess, hair a mess, all the big black strands tangled up around my ears. I remember putting my hands in front of my face like a boxer would have done. I must have looked ridiculous. I didn't recognize the man. He was thin, and he was white, and he had too much hair sprouting out of his face, so I must have thought he was one of Lady Diamond's lost property boyfriends. But he was too clean for a hippie. Not clean like you're clean after you've just washed, but clean like a piece of paper is clean before you write on it, before you've even left any of your dirty fingerprints behind. He looked too tall to be real, but then everything looked bigger than it should have done at that point. Even the kitten was puffing itself up in its jar, although it was doing this behind my back, I was sure. And as for his face, there are two kinds of expressions you see on people's faces when they're going out of their minds. There's the surprised, baby-faced look, when the acid kicks in and they realize that, Jesus Christ, the world really is a beautiful place underneath it all, if you ignore all the stupid details like matter. Then there's the other look, the dangerous one, the staring dead-ahead one. The man's features were pretty grim anyway, with all those wrinkles and scars hidden behind the bushes of black hairs on his face. But at that point in time, it was much, much too easy imagining him pulling out a Stanley knife and carving the words, "Fear me, for I am the beast," on his forehead, in capitals, even. Come to think of it, doesn't it strike you, after what I've just said, that I'm describing a kind of second-hand Charles Manson? Even his clothes, the ripped but clean jeans, the cheap but clean vest, made him look like he'd been living out of the desert with the coyotes for a month. Not like he belonged in the middle of London at all. Or is that just how I'm remembering him, in the light of what happened afterwards? 45. The man didn't say anything. Not straight away. He stared, and he stared, and he stared. So I started wondering whether he was really looking at me, or just watching the atoms dancing around my aura. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said, in the end. His voice was so ordinary, I don't even have to remember what kind of accent he had. There was no feeling there, though. I didn't have an answer to that. After all, he was right. Kind of. I remember wiping my nose. Hiding the evidence, maybe? "I'm a friend of ladies," I said. The man didn't say anything. He just kept staring. "Are you staying here?" I asked, which was a polite way of asking if he was Lady Diamond's current sleeping partner. Still no answer. Instead, the man stepped forward, heading right for me, and when he moved, I saw little echoes of himself in the space behind him, as if parts of him were sticking to the air when he walked through it. That didn't surprise me. Like I said, coke doesn't make you hallucinate. But it pumps up your senses to the point where sometimes you end up seeing things that have stopped being in the space where you're looking. This was kind of distracting, which is why I missed the fact that the man was heading straight for me, and also why I didn't do anything to get out of his way, even when it should have been obvious that he was getting ready to reach out and throttle me. 46. I've just read through the last couple of paragraphs. And no, it doesn't look right to me either. I'm sure there should be more to it than that. More suspense. The two of us face each other across the shop. More of a confrontation. More drama. But who am I kidding? I was stupid. Paranoid. I was a stupid paranoid, coked up cripple who could hardly move without having a panic attack. And him? He just wanted to kill me. Maybe I should rewrite it. So you genuinely think I'm being attacked by the dead things in the shop, and just when you think it's all a red herring and perfectly safe, ta-da! The real danger turns up. What do you think? Also, you're probably thinking that this is a bit of an unlikely plot twist. I leave the police station where they've just arrested a man for being the English Charles Manson. I'll patent that line if there'd be any point now. Only to stumble into a building where a real-life psychopath is waiting for me. You're right. It doesn't look good. For now, though. You'll just have to believe me when I say that the same thing would have happened even if I'd gone somewhere completely different. I mean, I was the chosen victim. Not that I knew it then. 47. Judging by the cannabis smoke in the passage, there was at least one hippie hanging around the back rooms, but I suppose he must have been too far away from Earth to hear the struggle when the man went for my throat. And Lady Diamond herself? I never did find out where she was, when her shop was wrecked and somebody tried to kill me. I only saw her once after that night, and by then I was already mixed up in events that were leading up to the end of the world, so I never got round to asking her about it. I suppose it's all academic now. For all I know, Lady looked into the future, saw the danger coming, and made sure she was out of the shop that night. Notes on the killer. 48. This is the way violence works in the real world. 1 minute, you're getting on with your life. Say, imagining there are dead kittens crawling up the legs of your jeans. And the next thing you know, there's a flurry of arms and legs, and there's spit raining down your face, and the only thing you can feel is the breath of some maniac who smells like he's been chewing on raw eggs. There's that real world thing coming into picture again. I'll have to watch out for that. 49. So, at 1:30 in the morning, on the 28th of September, 1970, you would have found me hobbling down the sides of Covent Garden, bleeding on the pavement from the wound in my leg. The roads were pretty much empty by the time, so there weren't any crowds gathering around me, nobody listening to me grunting and blubbering while I dragged myself along the street. I must have seen a couple of passer-bys on the way, people who were too slow to figure out that it was well past closing time. But so what if I did? London was like any other city on Earth. Everything was contagious there. If you saw someone on a bad trip, you crossed the road to get away from them, in case the little pixie demons jumped straight from their head to yours. If you saw someone with a bloody great hole in their leg, you stayed away from them as well, in case it turned out to be catching. I remember the wound being huge. I remember looking down through the gap in my shredded-up jeans and being able to see all the way down to the bone, where the man in the shop had bitten a whole chunk of flesh out of me. But I'm sitting here now, looking down at my right thigh and tracing the scar tissue where the skin grew over the hole later on. And it looks tiny. Hardly a mouthful. Is that because of the way the wound healed? Or does blood just make everything look worse than it is? 50/51. So how did I get the wound in the first place? Picture me, splayed out in the middle of the shop again, with my back pressed against Lady Diamond's all-purpose therapeutic beanbags. Imagine a pair of hands around my windpipe, not even trying to strangle me, not even trying to break my neck, but just keeping me pressed down, maybe hoping I'll get swallowed up by the beanbags if I stay down long enough. Now, see, from my point of view, I'm looking up towards the lights in the roof of the shop. Don't look up, remember, that was the rule. But I can't see the source of the light, because hovering over me is the head of a man who, these days, I remember looking like a cross between Manson and Long John Silver. That's all I can focus on, the shape of his head. All black and hairy until the pain doesn't matter anymore, and I start thinking about those stories you hear from people who've had near-death experiences. who say they saw Jesus Christ waiting for them in the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's what I can see now. Just a big shaggy face wearing a halo that's been supplied by the London Electricity Board. And suddenly all I can think about is how confusing it'd be if he killed me, because then how would I tell the difference between this and the afterlife? Then he shifts his weight. He tries to get a better grip on my throat. He still isn't trying to kill me, much. Just keeps me still, although that makes me wonder what he's keeping me still for. At this point I'm thinking, it's not murder, it's rape. And the thought's annoying, more than anything, because it makes my whole lifestyle feel worthless. Here she is, modern cosmopolitan woman, always telling her friends that she knows how to look after herself, but when the big horror comes to get her, it's the best she can do to hold up her fists like a 5-year-old and squeal like a pig. The panic gets worse after that, because when he shifts his weight, he moves his head just a little to the side, so all of a sudden I can see right up to the ceiling, and I see the layers of dead things hanging over me. I'm not worried about the dead things moving anymore. This time they're the spectators, waiting for the man to turn me into just another dead thing, or maybe even to get me pregnant with a dead thing baby. Then everything changes again. It's not until after it's all over that I work out why. My arms have been flapping around by my sides, working on automatic. My hands have seen that bit in Dial M for Murder, with Grace Kelly and the scissors, and I've got a hunch that they'll find a weapon if they flap around hard enough. So far they haven't. They've just been tearing at the bean bags, ripping them open, feeling those little polystyrene balls popping between their fingers. Now the man has shifted his balance. My body's starting to roll over so the arms can reach out further. Finding something solid, but not in that all-important pair of scissors, sadly. My fingers grab it before I even know what's going on. I pull at it, trying to bring it towards me. It's roundabout now that my hands figure out what it is. It's a table. The one Lady Diamond keeps her teacups on in the middle of the room, so it's not exactly the weapon I've been hoping for. I can't stab the man with it, or even hit him over the head with it. They've got nothing better to do, so my hands just tug harder to pull it over. Teacups are smashing against the floor. I can feel papery things falling onto my bare arm, and I guess that there were tarot cards on the table. All of a sudden it's raining wands and cups and discs and swords, and they're all made of cardboard. Finally the man lets go of my neck. There's something heavy on the side of my face, twisting my head to one side, pushing my cheek against Lady Diamond's best Persian rug. This is when he bites me. 52. The cards, as it turned out, weren't tarot cards at all. They were Zener cards. You might have seen Zener cards on TV, or at some time. Or at least you might have done if you're the way I imagined you. They're like a set of playing cards, but each one's marked with a different symbol in thick black ink. There's a star, there's a square, there's a circle, there's a bunch of wavy lines. Scientists, at least the kind of scientists who thought they'd have better things to do with their lives than stare at bacteria, used to use Zener cards in special lab tests to see whether or not people had telepathic powers. They didn't, usually. But Lady Diamond's Zener cards were different. Let's not forget, she reached the point where she didn't see a difference between magic, psychic powers, Buddhism, spiritualism, and drug abuse. As far as she was concerned, the only reason magic worked was because people were scared shitless of it. So when she decided to make Zener cards part of her routine, she went out of her way to draw the scariest card she could come up with. When the man in the shop twisted my head to one side, the first thing I saw, lying on the floor in front of my eyes, was a black line drawing of a naked man being hanged. The second thing I saw was the picture of a syringe, with something nasty dripping from the end of the needle. The third thing I saw was a swastika. The fourth thing I saw... You get the idea. Try reading my mind, and you'll have the shock of your fucking life. That's what Lady Diamond told the people she did her own telepathy experiments on. 53. A hanging man, a syringe, a swastika, a cartoon phallus, a black power symbol, a hammer and sickle emblem. These are the things I saw, lying there on the floor of the shop with my neck being broken. Like a kind of breadcrumb of trail cards leading across the rug. And then, right at the end of the trail, was the skull. A great big carved candle, the centerpiece of Lady Diamond's table, never meant to be lit. It was just sitting there, with its jawbone missing, trapping the last of the cards underneath its teeth. All those symbols, all those little pictures of human culture, all ending up in that big, bony mouth. You can read what you like into that. You can say it's symbolic if you like. A couple of hours earlier, I probably would have agreed with you. But at that point, I'd just started screaming, seeing as I'd lost a good amount of flesh from my right thigh. 54. There are lots of symbols in this book. Then again, I suppose that's what you'd expect. Everything was symbols back in London. A couple of years earlier, the only posters you could get in the shops had photos of pop stars on them, but now Lady Diamond was doing good business selling cheap four-color prints of Buddha and Jimi Hendrix, especially after his spectacularly crap death. Not to mention a couple of cartoons showing Jesus as a pothead in khakis. You could buy portraits of foreign revolutionary leaders in Woolsworth, for God's sake. Woolsworth! Sometimes I think that was why the world ended when it did. Because the human race had reached its limit. We'd spent thousands of years making things, designing things, coming up with symbols to keep ourselves happy, and now the symbols were taking over. We were building a world where only the icons mattered, and the people were a kind of embarrassing side effect. Humankind was bound to die out, because it wasn't needed anymore, because it wasn't as important as all the bits and pieces it had left behind. If everything hadn't come to a stop, we probably would have ended up living in a country run by smiley face badges. The smiley faces are another thing the end of the world saved us from. Like declimatization and another 4 years of Tory government. Why am I telling you all this? Oh yes, because there's something I want to share with you. I want to tell you exactly what I was thinking when I dragged myself out of the shop after I'd finally gotten away from the maniac. What I was thinking, at 1:30 on the morning of the 28th of September, was this. 55/56. We're all dead things. We're all dead things. But the fact that we're still moving stops us seeing it. My mother used to tell me something about the night I was born. She told me in the maternity ward, in the bed right next to ours, there was a woman whose baby came out sick. She couldn't remember what kind of sick, but something bad, something the doctors couldn't spot before the actual birth. The woman somehow managed to keep quiet right the way through the delivery, but when the baby finally came out the way it did, something just snapped. That's when she started screaming. Screaming and screaming and screaming until the doctors had to wheel her out of the ward, but she was still there when my mother started having the contractions, so I suppose the screaming could have been one of the first things I've ever heard. I wonder if that's important. The baby next door was definitely alive the day after the birth. Not that I remember this, but I know it slept in the cot next to mine in the hospital. I can't help thinking of all those babies lined up in their little boxes, all of them crying, all bald and slimy, but one of them different from the rest, sick, maybe dying. Look, this is what I'm getting at. We're like the things in Lady Diamond's shop, like skulls of those animals from India. We're collections of bones which have been given skin and fat for a little while so that we can move around. And why do we move around? So the bones are spread out for a bit after we die, sorted into pretty patterns just like ladies' relics. The things we come up with while we're walking around, the symbols and smiley face badges, they're all part of the collection as well. We stop moving, the fat falls off our bodies, the other dead things in the world lay us out in the ground, making sure we look nice for the archaeologists. Think about it. How long do we move around for? 70 years? 80? No time at all in the big picture. But how long do the archaeologists need us for? How long do we stay useful once we've been stripped down to the bone? Centuries. thousands of years, forever. So which is more likely? That we were put here to live, or that we were put here to be part of the bone collection and just don't know it yet? That's why I keep thinking about the maternity ward. All the babies in their little boxes, like that kitten pickled in Lady's jar. Let's not kid ourselves. It's the baby in the cot who's next to mine who will be the prize of the collection, not me. Little mutant, little curiosity. Which makes me wonder, who's the collection I'm being assembled for? I can just imagine them, the curators and the collectors, stalking the world whenever they think we're not looking, making sure we're still breeding and dying, taking inventories of us all on the quiet, changing the world around us behind our backs to make room for the exhibits, giving us more space to fill up with symbols and bones. Is that how the world's going to end? When they decide there are enough exhibits, and they take all the skin and fat away from us in one go? 57. That was what I thought while I was running anyways. But I was confused, I was upset, and I was coming down from a buzz. So don't think it's a lifetime philosophy or anything. But I suppose some parts of it are close to the truth. Let's go back in time again. Just a few minutes. Back to the shop. Ready? 58-59. I'm looking into the face of the wax skull. I'm staring at the Zener cards underneath its teeth, because they're the only thing I can focus on. I can feel the blood on my leg, and there's a kind of pain I've never felt before, stinging like somebody's injected floor cleaner into my leg. In fact, the flesh that's hurting isn't really there anymore, but I don't know that yet. I'm keeping my eyes on the cards, wondering if the picture right under the edge of the skull is really a porno version of a drawing from Alice in Wonderland, which is what it looks like from here. With the pain shutting off most of the rest of the world, this is all I can think about. I definitely don't have the presence of mind to ask the obvious questions. Who is this man? Why has he bitten me? If his mouth is all the way down there, then what part of his body is he using to crush my head against the floor? I can't move my left arm. It's pressed against my body, against my rib cage, with all the man's weight on top of it. My right arm's twisted under me, but the fingers are still moving, crawling across the rug, looking for a weapon that's never there when you need it. My legs are kicking, although my feet feel like they're a world away, and I can't say I care about them much anyway. No, I'm more interested in the noise I can hear over this heavy breathing that could be either his or mine. A slapping noise. Wet. To hell with the pain. To hell with the cards. This is the important thing now. That sound. Like a tongue rolling around inside of someone else's mouth. Christ. He's tasting me. He didn't bite me to hurt me or to get some kind of sex kick. He wants to know what I taste like. This man who came out of nowhere and attacked me for no good reason, because it's starting to look unlikely that he's one of Lady Darwin's sleeping partner, is in fact a cannibal. For the first time I start to think about the other murderers. I try to remember what I've seen in the papers, whether the victims had bite marks on their bodies. Would the police mention if they did? The pain isn't important. It's like when you're a kid and the antiseptic goes into your cut and it feels like you're going to sting forever, but after a while you have to face the fact that you're going to be in agony for the rest of your life. All of a sudden there isn't so much weight on the side of my face. I turn my head because I can, not all the way, just enough to be able to see the killer out of the corner of one eye. His halo makes my eyes burn. There are tears, although I don't remember crying. I can't see properly. There's just a silhouette as the man lifts up his head on the end of a long, long neck. I realize that I can't see the dead things anymore, because the man's big enough to blot them out, taking up too much light for a skinny thing like him. He pulls his head back even further until I can see the outline of the lump in his throat. There's a howling sound. No. Howling makes it sound like this was a mammal noise. A wolf noise. This is more primal, more basic. Give an amoeba a set of vocal cords, and this is the sound it'd make. It isn't him. It can't be him. It's not human. I decide it must be the dead things, complaining that they can't see me dying. My arms and legs are still flapping, and my legs are kicking, and I can feel the man's weight shift again, so the lower part of my body comes free underneath him. My body starts to realize that all it'd take is one good shove, and suddenly my left arm's free. And before I can tell it what to do, it's curling up into a fist, punching the air. I try to follow it with my eyes, but my eyes are full of water. I feel my knuckles press against him. He feels like leather. I don't remember him wearing anything made of leather, so I'm starting to wonder if it's his skin I'm touching. It takes me a good while to notice that all the weight's gone. The man isn't on top of me anymore, and I'm free. I'm rolling on my back, pushing all my limbs into the air, kicking and clawing like a baby. This is when I first started thinking of the maternity ward, Natch. I feel my hands move against him. I feel my legs kick his stomach. Something in the back of my mind tells me that if all 4 of my limbs have touched him, then he must be bigger than I thought. The dead things are furious. The howling's getting worse, too. I can hear something else, like rippling air, like a great big pair of wings flapping around inside the shop. I don't remember any of the dead things having wings, but I can imagine some kind of stuffed vulture, maybe. One of Lady Diamond's relics. I've never spotted before. I think about it, ripping itself off the wall and circling overhead, waiting for the cannibal man to finish his job. Except that there isn't a man at all. I can't feel him now, not even with my fingertips. I keep kicking, even though the howling stopped, and even though there's nothing touching me. But there's just the stinging in my leg, so I start to get angry with that part of my body, blaming my leg for trying to put me off. 60. The next sound I heard was the cracking of glass, in and out, over in a few seconds. 1 minute he was trying to kill me, and the next he was gone. At the time, I didn't really care why he'd left me. I must have thought I'd been too much of a struggle. I must have thought I'd fought him off with all that kicking and clawing. If I'd been thinking, I would have realized how ridiculous that was. And if I'd been thinking, I would have guessed that he just hadn't liked the way I'd tasted, which would have been a lot closer to the truth, really. 61. I once saw a documentary on BBC Two about a man who said he remembered fighting in the English Civil War, even though it had finished about 300 years before he'd been born. He had all these memories about the places he'd been and the weapons he'd used, and even remembered the name he'd had. I can't remember what it was, so we'll just say Davy Jones, like the boring English one out of the Monkees. Researchers from the BBC went through the old museum records and found that there really had been a Davy Jones, or whatever, fighting in the English Civil War. Also, he'd fought in all the battles the man had talked about. The people who made the program said this was good evidence of reincarnation. Which makes you think, doesn't it? Whoever you are, however unimportant your life is, just remember this. Hundreds of years from now, your name could be all over TV, and your birth certificate could be dug out of the libraries by researchers whose names you'll never even get to hear. Because it's not just your bones you leave behind. All that rubbish, all those possessions, all those symbols and bits of paperwork. It doesn't matter how deep you bury them, someone's bound to dig them up and rearrange them sooner or later. 62. The window of the shop was cracked right across, so it looked like all of the posters on the glass were the only things holding it together. The front door was smashed, and the panels were smashed. Not just cracked, but smashed. What? Oh, pardon me. The posters on the glass of the door were the only thing holding it together. The front door was open, and the panels were smashed. Not just cracked, but smashed. So I guessed that the man, whoever he had been, had made straight for the exit after he'd let go of me. He'd thrown himself at the door, broken the lock, and shattered the glass on his way out. No, I didn't stop to think about that either. About the logic of someone, even a madman, forcing open a locked door instead of taking the way back out. It can't have mattered to me much. The next thing I remember is moving along Henrietta Street, grunting and whimpering, with my hand pressed against the hole in my leg to stop the blood flow. I hadn't even bothered trying to find help in the back rooms of the shop. You can't trust a hippie in an emergency. I was going back the way I'd came. I was heading for the police station, because in a crisis, even an anti-establishment waste of space like me isn't too proud to go to the police. 63. By the way, I know not much of this will be making sense to you yet. There are too many questions. So, although I didn't know any of the answers at the time, I'll give some clues now. I wasn't the hairy man's target. Not really. Think back to what I said about the police station. Think back to the moment when the big blonde man reached out for me, and I thought I'd been touched by the English Charles Manson, patent pending. Suppose I told you that it was the big blonde who'd been the real prey of the man in the shop. Suppose I told you that the man had a way of sniffing out his target, and that he'd just happened to pick up the blondie's scent on my skin. Suppose I said that he didn't realize his mistake until he'd taken a good bite out of me. It probably wouldn't help you much. After all, it sets up as many questions as it answers. You'd just say that no human being could possibly have a sense of smell that good, and you'd be right. Besides, wasn't the blonde man supposed to be the butcher of Buckingham Palace, according to the police? So how come he's the victim all of a sudden? Answers. More trouble than they're worth. That's what I say. Just take a little sip. 2 hours. Actually, that means it's another good time for a break. I'm just going to mute this time. I'm not going to bother going over to the screen. Unless people want to see the art screen to give them something to look at. But this is another notes section, so feel free to take a moment to go to the washroom. I am going to step away, and you know what? I'm going to roll an ad like a streamer is supposed to do. See you in a minute. I just realized that if I don't put up the standby screen, it just looks like I'm sitting around at an empty thing, so I'm going to put up the standby screen. See you in a bit. And we are back. Well, I decided I've had enough Coke Zero for a little bit, so I've decided to swap out for some nice iced tea. Honestly, I'm just trying to break the ice from coming back. Now, I'd like to reiterate, as we come back from, I guess what was effectively a commercial break. I guess that's what these are, commercial breaks. I'll just reiterate that this is to support local independent theater, and if you happen to be suspiciously wealthy or know someone who is suspiciously wealthy, we would love for you to help support Canadian art, and Lord knows Canadian art needs it. I shouldn't be shady. I shouldn't be shady to Canadian art. I should always speak well of things. But either I'm sure some of my cast members are listening to this either retroactively or possibly live right now. But I think it's worth noting that we're 2 hours into this book, and an important character has not even been introduced properly yet, and so you can see just how much Lucas. Oh yes, thank you, Josh. Yes, the Indiegogo is still live. It is live for another 5 days. This is the last week that it's running, and so the reason I'm reading this book is to kind of hopefully boost its media profile a bit. I'm hoping that people who are subscribed to us and things like that will find it, and I will probably do a extremely rough what do you call it, breakdown of or not breakdown, edit of these videos, and see if I can get them up before the Kickstarter ends, so that way they can also be on YouTube. I think the amount, the goal I set was pretty reasonable, but I don't have much sway and influence in the world, so maybe it was unreasonable for my, what's the word I'm looking for? My mimetic sphere of influence. All right. Enough about me and my stuff that's going on. as I said, support the Indiegogo if you can, and if not, if you happen to live in the Greater Toronto area, then April 1st, from April, excuse me, from April 1st to April 8th. No, that's not right, is it? Excuse me, from April 1st to April 6th. What's the Indiegogo address link? Well, if you scan that QR code that's on the screen right now, that will take you to the Indiegogo. I don't know how I don't know if you have your mobile device next to you, though you're probably right. I should probably just have the link typed out somewhere, but I don't have it copy-pasted at the moment. Though I guess I could just pull out my phone and... Actually, where is my phone? But that's not what we're here for. I'm not here to do this. Yeah, feel free to throw up the link, pin it in the chat if you like. I might have to pin, I don't know. Okay, I think I've done enough of a reintroduction. I don't like to ramble. I when I run out of things to say, I get political or personal. So let's get back to the story. Let's get back to Larry Miles' political views from. Well, actually, that would be "This Town Will Never Let Us Go." I'm not going to worry about this. Let's. Anyways, pin. There we go. Unpin after. Manually unpinned or at end of stream. There we go. Yeah, there we go. That's what we'll do. Oh, no, stop. Okay. All right. I'll take one more sip. My plan tonight, by the way, is to get through the first notebook. We might split the other notebooks up just to, what was I going to say? Just to give it some length, but the plan is to go all the way. That's not quite the word. All the way through the notebook. That's what I was trying to say. All right. Notes on the... Oh, and we're about halfway through, I guess is worth noting. Notes on the thing in the cell. 64. Really, it's a miracle I got as far as the police station. I fell over at least once on the way down, ending up face down in the gutter somewhere off of Strand, bleeding into the papers and Pepsi cans in the road. Not that I wanted to keep reminding you of this, but I still had the coke in my system, and coke's got a way of boosting your senses. Just then it was boosting my sense of drama more than anything else. Even while I was making my way up the station steps. I was imagining the big entrance, throwing the double doors open, standing there in the doorway, obviously still in agony, all wounded and windswept. I was thinking about the faces of the policemen inside, looking shocked and startled, amazed that I'd made it there alive. I was thinking how surprised and sorry they'd be when they'd figured out that the girl they'd been arrested for being a useless junkie was in fact the victim in this story. Yes, you fascist bully boy pigs, that's right, look embarrassed. Then they'd rush towards me, catching me just as the last of my strength gave out. But there wasn't anybody in the station. At least not in the foyer. The foyer was a kind of waiting room, painted the same greys and greens you saw in waiting rooms everywhere. The front desk was on the other side of the floor, half a universe away from where I was standing. A great oblong piece of tack that was pretending to be old, expensive wood just to give offenders that up-before-the-beak feeling. There was the smell of disinfectant on the floor. There were neon strip lights flickering in the ceiling, but there weren't any signs of life. The cartoon posters on the wall were telling me to fasten my seatbelt and watch out for pickpockets, and that was all anybody was saying. I must have stood there for a while, dripping blood on the tiles. I was standing in the exact spot where I'd been planning on passing out. Frankly, I was pissed off that I wasn't going to get the chance. In the end, I managed to stagger over to the other side of the room, still clutching the gash in my leg. Gash, she says. See how I make it sound smaller with every page? The chairs were still scattered across the floor, more higgledy-piggledy than they'd been before. I remember thinking that the blonde man must have kept struggling, which made me wonder if he'd won the fight. If the reason there was nobody here was that all the staff had been torn from limb to limb. I tried not to let it worry me. 65. Keep one thing in mind here. About an hour earlier, I met the alleged killer face to face, and he'd made a lunge for me. Or at least that was how I remembered. Or at least that's how I was starting to remember it. My very first meeting with a possible mass murderer, and yet almost immediately afterward, I'd been half strangled by another one. You can imagine how paranoid I was about that. If you told me at the time that something had happened to the world while I'd been looking away, that 50% of the human race had suddenly turned psychotic in order to finish the species off once and for all, I would have believed you. The theory fitted all the facts, let's be honest. 66. I'd just like to say I'm sorry for saying higgledy-piggledy earlier on. I can't stand that. 67. There was somebody behind the front desk at the police station. I hadn't seen him from the door because he was slumped down on the other side of the desk, and with his back to the wood and his legs stretched out in front of him. I didn't spot him until I headed for the corridor where the cells were. It was the desk sergeant, the one who told me to sod off earlier on. His skin was covered in sweat, so thick and gooey that it made him look like all the fluids inside his skull had started seeping out of his pores. And he was staring dead ahead at the blank wall in front of him. His face wasn't square anymore. It had gone all blubbery. I also remember that the phone on the desk was off its hook, and the receiver was dangling from a cord, swinging back and forth next to the man's head. Like he'd started to make a call, but had given up. It took him a while to notice me standing there. When he did, he turned his head toward me, very, very slowly. "Name?" he said. "Christine," I told him, automatic reaction that. "Christine what?" I said. The sergeant nodded, but carefully making sure the movement didn't make his eyeballs drop out. "Name?" he said. 68. I've heard people talk like that before, but usually only when they've been on amphetamines. They get caught up in a kind of cycle. They get fixed on one single part of their lives, and they keep going through it over again and again, building whole rituals out of it until it's the only thing that matters to them. It'd be nice as in interesting, to say that the sergeant had gone mad, and he'd seen something so horrible he'd lost his mind right then and there. It'd be nice, but it wouldn't be true. In fact, he'd seen something so horrible that he'd run away from it in the only way he could. He dug a little trench in himself and covered himself over with his paperwork. In shock? Yes. Mad? No. I know this for two reasons. Firstly, it was only a couple minutes later that I saw what he'd seen, so I know what he must have felt. Secondly, I know for a fact that the sergeant retired from the police force, and tried to find a new career for himself in Hertfordshire. A career that was tragically cut short when the concept of Hertfordshire stopped meaning anything on the 12th of October. It was in one of the local papers, although the reporter was smart enough not to print the details of what had actually happened at the station. I've got the cuttings in the scrapbook I brought with me from London. Am I the only person left who cares about the little historical details, do you think? And, by the way, his name was Elliot Bishop, if that helps give him any kind of personality. 69. I need help, I told the man who was actually called Elliot Bishop. I took my hand away from my leg when I said it, and held my fingers up to show him the blood that had dried over the room. The sergeant nodded again. "Christine what?" he said. 70. Now I'm writing this all down, I'm wondering about the telephone dangling by his ear. Did he try to call someone when the bad thing came to the police station? If he did, then who? And why did he give up? I think I can answer that last one, anyway. I could have dialed 999 from Lady Diamond's shop, but I never even thought about it. I mean, by then I'd convinced myself that the world was run by dead things, and that the only reason we were all still walking around was so we could scatter our bones around for artistic effect. But I know I needed medical help. But phoning the emergency services would have felt pathetic, almost a joke. Hello, operator. The world's just stopped working, and all life on Earth is effectively meaningless. Is it police, ambulance, or fire brigade I need? Sergeant Elliot Bishop must have felt the same way. How English can you get? Scared to make an emergency call because of how stupid he thought he'd sound. 71. I headed down the cell corridor after that, and the sergeant didn't try to stop me, although I could hear him shouting at me shouting after me while I was walking away from him, asking, "Christine what? Christine what?" over and over again. I didn't listen. I was going to find the other policemen in the station and make them help me whether they wanted to or not. Yes, that's right. By this point I was sure the desk sergeant had lost his mind just to make things harder for me. My leg was numb by now. The same kind of numb you hear Arctic explorers talking about in radio interviews. That "you'll be dead soon, so stop worrying" kind of numb. I knew I didn't have long before I fell over again. But even the cell block corridor was against me, getting a half a step longer every time I took a step forward. I tried counting off the cell doors as I walked past them, making sure the building wasn't stretching out the passage to slow me down, but I kept losing count and having to start back at one again. I tried counting my footsteps, the number of times my plimsolls squeaked on the tiles. Then I tried counting the number of times I heard the word "Christine what?" from behind me. Nothing made the corridor any shorter. And it could have been paranoia, of course. And it's the fact that the more tired you are, the longer things look. It's probably all part of the theory of relativity. But remember what I said before? There were things in the world. Things that came out of the shadows only when our backs were turned. Things that, and here's the important bit, moved space around when we weren't looking, making sure we had just enough room to bury our leftovers. And there, in that grey, squeaky cell corridor, they were making sure that I had too far to walk. Making sure my bones were going to drop to the ground in exactly the right place. Again, I'm not claiming any of this was literally true. 72. Halfway along the corridor, can something that doesn't have an end and can something that doesn't have an end have a halfway point? Do you think? I stopped. All the cell doors had little hatches at eye level, sliding peepholes the policemen could use to stare at the prisoners just to get them extra tense. And one of the hatches was open. I think most of the cells must have been empty, but that one wasn't. You could tell. There was a pair of eyes behind the peephole. It was the cell I'd been in an hour or so earlier. The eyes belonged to the woman who I'd shared it with. The stuff woman. "It won't work," she said, when she saw me. The door made her voice go all muffled, so she sounded like she was talking through a gag. I said. I was too tired to put proper sentences together. "They're trying to freak me out," the woman said. "That's why they're making all the noise. They're going to try and make me sign a confession." "Noise," I repeated. The woman nodded. Her eyes bobbed up and down on the other side of the hatch. "The pigs. They've got someone next door. Screaming, you know." Her eye wobbled to the left just in case I couldn't work out what next door meant. "One of them. One of the pigs. Screaming. They reckon it'll mess our heads up." "Screaming," I said. "Screaming," she said. "But it's not going to work." 73. I never found those other policemen. The desk sergeant was the only uniform in the building, and as far as I could tell. The local papers never said anything about any police officers going missing, or any of them apart from Sergeant Elliot Bishop retiring for health reasons. And I'm sure somebody would have said something if they'd been killed right there in the station. Perhaps they just ran for their lives when the bad thing came, and let Sergeant Bishop deal with things on his own. But that's not what I like to think. I like to think I was right about the corridors being stretched. I like to imagine the bad thing just made the corridor so long that nobody could ever reach the end of it. I like the idea of all those policemen running past an infinite number of cells trying to get back to the front desk, but never quite making it. I suppose that would have gotten a mention in the paper as well, wouldn't it? Never mind. We've got to dream. 74. The cell next door wasn't locked. I didn't realize that straight away, but until the stuff woman rolled her eyes at it. The door was only open a crack. The corridor was lit by a kind of strip lighting that had brightened up the foyer, by tubes of neon that were the same color as varicose veins, but there was no light coming through the gap behind the door. The lock was broken, though. Bits of metal latch all over the floor. "Have a look," said the woman. "There's one of the pigs in there. Bet you any money." Screaming, the woman had said. Screaming from the cell. I didn't seriously believe the police were torturing suspects in there. This was WC2, for God's sake. They might have beaten the shit out of the occasional drunk outside of Tottenham Court tube station, but since when had English policemen used professional torture? And I didn't believe it was one of the officers making the noise either, just to wind up the prisoners. No, I was remembering what had happened back at Lady Diamond's shop. There had been that sound. The sound the Jesus-Manson look-alike had made, just after he'd got fed up of throttling me. I told myself it'd been the dead things making the noise, on the grounds that it couldn't have come from a human being. But all of a sudden, this theory was starting to look a bit on the shaky side. I was remembering the man rearing up over me, just before the window had cracked. I was remembering his head being lifted up on a neck that looked much, much too long for his body, like his skin had been stretching in front of my eyes. Had that actually happened, though? Or was I starting to imagine things now that it was over? "Name," said the desk sergeant from the end of the corridor. He'd obviously given up asking Christine what, and gone back to the start of the loop. And there was something else. Another sound. Not the sergeant, not the woman, but a voice from inside the open cell, someone talking or muttering on the other side of the door. 75. It wasn't much of a shock for me, finding out that there really were dark, slippery, scary things in the world. Everybody knows it, and everybody pretends they don't in case they get put on medication. If you pretend hard enough, you even get to be a psychiatrist. I remember believing in fairies when I was younger. I remember believing that the world was full of beautiful, shiny, little winged people who worked magic while the rest of us weren't looking, and nobody who lived in all the places who lived in all the places nobody else could go. Then I grew up and went through puberty and got cynical. After that, I believed the fairies were totally malevolent and utterly this is a new word for me. Inimical to all human life. I wasn't far wrong either. 79. What I heard from the other side of the door was the voice of a man reading what turned out to be poetry. I couldn't make out most of the words at the time, but since then I've heard the poem again. Actually, I learned most of it by heart, so I know that what the voice was saying was this. Dank roofs, dark entried, closely clustered walls, murder-inviting rooks, death-reeking gutters. A boding voice from your foul chaos calls. When will men heed the warning that it utters? "See," said the woman in the other cell. The other woman in the cell was saying, through the hole in the door. "He's praying, you know. They reckon it's going to put the shits up us." "Name," shouted the desk sergeant. I remember lifting my hand, holding back for a second. Then putting my fingers on the door of the cell, ready to open up the crack, I could hear somebody moving inside, shuffling across the floor, and the voice was still speaking, carrying on with the poem. There floats phantoms, a phantom on the slum's foul air, shaping to eyes which have the gift of seeing into the spectre of that loathly air. Face it, for vain is fleeting. I pushed the door open. By that time I couldn't remember what I was supposed to be doing, or even why I'd gone to the police station in the first place. 77. And if I'd known I was about to come face to face with the worst thing in the world and see the real shape of the cannibal who'd attacked me in Lady Diamond's shop, if I'd known that by walking into the middle of the cell, I'd be walking into the middle of a war that didn't even belong on my planet. If I'd known, would I still have done it? Well, let's not pretend I had a choice. 78. There was a man in the corner of the cell, crouching on a bed that had been stripped of just about everything except the springs. The blonde man. The suspect. His legs were curled up under him, with his feet on the edge of the bed, so it looked like he was getting ready to leap off and into the air. But his eyes were shut, and he wasn't moving. The blue suit looked wrong here, like it was too neat for the cell, like it didn't match either the moonlight from the tiny window or the neon from the corridor. The man looked smaller than he'd looked before, less powerful, less aggressive. Of course, it's not hard to figure out why. It was because the other thing in the cell was so much bigger and so much worse than a supposed maniac cult killer, and that'd probably all make Charles Atlas look small, and if Charles Atlas was still alive. To begin with, it was just a heap, a lump, something the color of rotting meat, so my first guess was that it was a pile of bodies, and that made me jump, thinking that maybe I was looking at the corpses of all the policemen that the blonde man had dragged into his cell and then torn them apart with his bare hands. But that was one thing, not lots. And all the bodies were joined together. And then it turned its head, swung its big brontosaurus neck towards me, letting me see the muscles rippling under its skin. With every move it made, setting off a kind of fleshy chain reaction, sending out ripples all over its body. Something huge, black and flat, swung towards me, and I remember ducking, even though the shape, the wing, stopped before it reached my head. It had been in the shop. It had stretched its wings there for the first time on Earth. It had forced its way out through the shop door, breaking the glass as it went, probably deciding I wasn't worth finishing off. Then it had come straight here to find the blonde man, the person it had been after all along. It had moved through the streets of London, keeping out of sight the way these things always keep out of sight, finally pushing its way into the station and forcing open the cell door with its sheer weight. How it had squeezed through the door, I didn't ask. Its body could have been made of putty for all I knew. I heard the shuffling around the cell from the corridor, moving in what little floor space there was, with the wingtips scraping the walls. Purely by accident, it had pushed the door half shut behind it. I don't think it cared much about privacy. 79. There's another memory I've got that I'm not too sure about. I didn't mention it earlier, because the more I think about it, the more it feels like something I imagined afterwards, or maybe even dreamt about. But it's like this. I remember looking up from the floor of Lady Diamond's shop, and seeing the Manson clones just before he flew off. I remember his skin splitting open, and his clothes splitting open as well, like they were just another part of his body. I remember wings tearing out the holes in his back, even though I know I couldn't have seen his back from where I was laying. Of course, I didn't have this memory in my head when I arrived at the police station, so if it's real and not a dream, I must have blotted it out of my head after it happened. Can you blame me? 80. The blonde man opened his eyes when I peeked in through the door of the cell. That's one of those little details I probably didn't pick up on at the time, with everything else that was happening. Another little detail is that some of the electronic parts he'd been carrying, remember those, were scattered around him on the bed. The police must have let him keep them when they put him in the cell. They probably thought it couldn't do any harm. If I'd been thinking things through, those electronic bits and pieces would have reminded me of something. The way they were arranged around him, like some kind of chalk circle, Dennis Wheatley style. Like a barrier against the thing that had come to get him in his cell. And the poem? All part of the ritual. The thing must have gotten to the police station a long while before I did, but the blonde man had been keeping it at bay all that time. Now I'd interrupted him. Broken the spell? Probably. The thing finished swinging its neck around until its head was just a couple inches from mine, and I could see its face in full. The features were kind of vague, but at least they were human. Dark eyes. Haven't slept in days eyes. Bad skin. A wide-open, gaping mouth. Skinny cheeks that were much too narrow for its big head. Dark hair on its scalp, stuck together in ugly, sweaty clumps. "Can you see them?" shouted the woman next door. "Name?" asked Sergeant Elliot Bishop. The second to last thing I remember was realizing that I was staring at a reflection. It was my face I was looking at, because where the thing in the cell should have had eyes and a mouth, there was just glass. A great big lens that had grown in the middle of its head, like, I don't know, like a pearl inside an oyster. A shiny oval as smooth and blank as a TV screen with the power off. The last thing I remember was the sound of the thing screaming at me. After which along with the shock, the terror, the exhaustion, and the fact that I was only a couple minutes away from dying of blood loss, was more than enough to make me pass out. Notes on the Flat, 81. This is what I dreamt about, after I passed out. Space. Space looks full when you see it in the sky at night. The stars are all clustered together, so you can imagine taking taxi rides from one planet to another. It's not until you're right in the middle of it, swimming through a vacuum with your lungs tearing themselves into little pieces, that you realize the truth. However hard you swim, and whichever way you turn, none of the stars are going to get much closer. Except that it's not a vacuum. Not really. Space is made up of black winged things, all locked together like salamanders in that M.C. Escher picture Cal used to have on his bedroom door, so you can't see any gaps between their bodies. They're space. Living space. You try to claw your way through them, looking for oxygen and choking on the black putty flesh. The planets and stars? They're not solid at all. They're just the spaces the winged things haven't filled in yet. The space where they keep their odds and ends. From here, in the dream space, you can see all the planets the way they see them. All those cultures, all those races, leaving behind their bones and icons in interesting patterns. Each of the planets makes its own kind of relics. Some planets build big spiky ships to nuzzle their way through space. Some planets build great big cities or great big graveyards, if there's any difference from this point of view. You can't see Earth for some reason, though you can bet that its contributions to the culture are its murderers and t-shirts. And there, close to the center of the galaxy, a galaxy being the collective noun for the winged things, you see a world that's way ahead of all the others, where the people have invented machines for taking time apart. The people probably hope the machines are going to be enough to hold the winged things off, to stop the darkness swarming over their home world. They've got to live in hope, I suppose. The surface of that world is dusty and dry, and all the cities are empty. The locals have gone underground, where they're breeding special soldiers for the fight ahead, stitching the time travel machines right into the soldier's skin. The only living thing on the surface is the blonde man, the one from the police station. He's standing in a circle of computer parts, looking up at the sky with a frozen look on his face and something that might or might not be a knife in his hand. You can tell what he's thinking. He's thinking, "You're not getting past me, you bastards." 82. What's the point of dreams, anyways? I mean, the human race is supposed to have evolved over millions of years and ditch all the parts it doesn't need. So why has evolution left the dreams behind? They don't do anything except make you feel itchy and give you clues about who you're supposed to want to sleep with. And don't tell me they're a way of clearing out your short-term memory. Why would all the pictures be held together with stories just to do that? Maybe evolution's getting us ready for some kind of future technology. Not that my planet's over going to develop it now. Maybe it thinks that if we keep dreaming, we'll be kept on our toes, and we'll be ready when people really do start turning into talking dogs. Or whatever. 83. I woke up in a strange man's bed, in a strange man's flat. This wasn't a new experience for me, so to begin with, I didn't panic. The bedroom wasn't big, and there wasn't much in the way of furniture. The bed against one wall, a bookcase against another, orange curtains pulled across the window, daylight on the other side, making everything orange. You could still smell the splinters on the bare floorboards, as if whoever owned the place hadn't lived there in more than a month or so, hadn't finished unpacking his things and unloading all his old scents into the building. There was a duvet pulled over me, but even the duvet didn't have a cover. I could hear the dogs and cars from outside the window. The way I saw things was this. I'd taken coke. The coke had sparked off something in my head. Maybe some old acid that got stuck in the middle of my brain. And B, I have no idea whether this is actually possible. Setting off a complete paranoid breakdown. So I'd been arrested. So I'd met someone while I wasn't thinking straight and ended up in the bed with him, and that he was here to welcome me back to the world with a cup of coffee. And not that he was here to welcome me back into the world with a cup of coffee or anything. Everything in between made sense as long as you looked at it in a kind of psychiatric way. That thing in the police station, the great long neck, the shiny bulb of a face on the end. If that wasn't Freudian, then what was? It was so obvious, it didn't even count as a hallucination. 84, 85. There were a lot of people seeing Freudian monsters in 1970. In the scrapbook, which I can't be bothered getting out of my rucksack again right now, there's a clipping from a magazine called Fate, which used to be the kind of journal of choice for the kind of people who wanted to believe that there were giant owl monsters living out in the wilds of Canada. According to the article, asylum inmates all over the world had been having weird visions in the early months of 1970. If that's true, then it must have been something to do with the things I'm describing in this book, although I'm sure Fate always used to say that asylum inmates had been having weird visions. But this particular crisis reached its peak sometime in a mental hospital in India, sometime in June. A dangerous psychopath there started developing strange symptoms, changes in the texture of his skin, changes in body temperature, that kind of thing, which the staff at the hospital must have thought must have been psychosomatic. The electric shock treatment didn't work, though, and what happened next is harder to swallow. According to the one surviving doctor at the hospital, the patient went through a complete physiological, did I spell that right? Mutation. The skin on his face stretched out of shape. His hip bones shifted around, so he almost looked like he was supposed to walk on 4 legs instead of 2. Finally, the skin on his back split open, sound familiar this? And wings grew out of his body, making some of the doctors give up their medical training and turn back to religion. All of this was bad enough, but it turned out to be contagious. It happened that way in mental institutions, apparently. If one lunatic came up with a new symptom, it got spread around in the place. Once the inmates in India heard about the man with wings, they all started showing signs of change as well. Until the staff couldn't tell which ones were faking it and which ones were really growing scales. Just picture it. All those little cells, all those mad men and mad women twisting out of shape one after another. Why does it make me think of the maternity ward again? Eventually, the staff gave in to it. until one night the whole institution exploded into a fleshy, bony mess. One of the doctors, the one who ended up being the only survivor, reacted in the only way he could. He took out a gun. Fate doesn't tell us where he got the gun from, so maybe we're supposed to believe that Indian asylum staff are armed around the clock, and started putting the creatures out of their misery. He said he had to shoot some of them through the head 3 or 4 times before they stopped screaming. Of course, as the things magically changed back to their normal human selves once they were dead, the authorities only had the doctor's word that any of this happened. Just like we've only got Fate's word that the hospital ever really existed. 86. Somehow I managed to get out of the bed and headed straight for the window. I pulled back the curtains, looked out. I was a couple of floors up, but I didn't recognize the neighborhood. Back streets, parked cars, and council dustbins stretching out as far as the eye could see. The kind of daylight that hurts you. Hangover daylight. Could have been any part of London. The next stop was the bookcase. You could tell a lot about someone by the books they kept. I mean, I had my pride to think about. Suppose I'd ended up in a bed with someone who still read Allen Ginsberg and took him seriously. How could I have lived with that? Some of the titles on the bookshelves were Life Under the Glass by Mark Reedon, Ozma of Oz by L. Frank Baum, or Frank L. Baum, or whatever it is, Dawson's Concise English Dictionary, The Final Program by Michael Moorcock, Confessions of an English Opium Eater by Thomas de Quincey, yum, and The Script of Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. Of course, these are just the books that stick in my mind, so the list probably says more about me than about the person who owned them. It looked like someone had bought the bookcase, then realized he didn't have anything to put it on. Like he'd gone around all the second-hand bookshops in the city, buying up any cheap paperbacks he could find and stuffing them onto his shelves in no real order. Like he thought that'd be the best way to find out about modern culture. Funnily enough, that was exactly what he had done, but it took me a while to find this out. There was also a scrapbook on one of the shelves, although I didn't notice it then, which was a good job, because it was full of press cuttings about famous murderers, and I might have got the wrong idea. 87, 88. The other thing I noticed about the bookcase was the cardboard box on top of it, full of bits of grey plastic. A model kit, made by Airfix. According to the label on the side of the box, it was a, quote, genuine ship in a bottle, modeled on some Tudor warship or other that made history by sinking without a... modeled on some Tudor warship or other that had made history by sinking without a trace in record time. It wasn't a proper ship in a bottle, of course. Real ships in bottles are more complicated than the kits you used to get at Hamley's. With the Airfax sets, they gave you a see-through plastic bottle in 2 halves, which you were supposed to glue together around the finished ship. That was cheating, in my book. And I guess the owner of the kit must have felt the same way, because the ship had only been half finished. A few parts had been glued together, but you could tell he'd given up out of boredom. Like he couldn't see the point in anything so simple. I stood there for a while, looking at the cracked spines of the old paperbacks, trying to get a grip on the person who'd put them there. My leg was itching, so I started scratching it, not taking my eyes off the book until one of my nails slipped into the hole in my leg. The hole in my leg. Eventually it clicked. I looked down. There was a wound in my leg, all right, where the Freudian thing had bitten a chunk out of me. The wound had been clean, so there was no blood, although I could see lots of red under the skin where it had been broken open. The hole must have been about 1.5 inches across. Again, I could be misremembering this. So the thing had been planted. So the thing that had been planted there was about the same size and shape as a small boiled potato. Let's go over that again. Someone had planted what looked like a small, boiled potato in the hole in my leg. I could even see tiny shoots coming out of it, working their way into my flesh. The little bastard was taking root in my body. The thing was turning pink around the edges, like it was trying to hide in the middle of all the other cells, hoping I wouldn't notice that it wasn't part of me. It was itching, the way wounds always itch when you notice how bad they are, and I wanted to scratch the lump right out. But I could see the shoots either pumping something into me or sucking something out. I wondered how much blood I'd lose if I took it away. My jeans were folded up at the end of the bed. Folded badly. The way only a man could have done it. Next to them were my shoes, my socks, my belt. I didn't bother taking any of them. A t-shirt and pair of pants were all I needed to face the world. I just headed straight for the door. 89. The hallway of the flat was a lot like the bedroom. Bare boards, no carpet, although an old rug had been stretched across the floor near what looked like the front door. There was a phone nailed to one wall, and plenty of doors leading away from the hall, most of them closed, all of them unmarked. No cutesy little plates saying things like, John's room. Nothing to give me any clues. Not that I had to do much exploring. I heard the voice as soon as I walked into the hall. It was coming from the far end of the passage, from behind a door that had been left half open. So bright. Sorry, there was a notification jump scared me. Oh gosh. Anyways, it was coming from the far end of the passage, from behind a door that had been left half open, so bright daffodil-colored daylight could pour into the hall from the other side. The last time I heard that voice, it'd been reciting poetry. The voice was in the middle of a conversation, maybe even an argument, although I couldn't make out what the owner was arguing with. I guessed that he was on the telephone. The fact that the telephone was right next to me in the hall didn't put me off. The voice sounded young, but a bit croaky, like an 8-year-old who's been smoking fags on the quiet. He went up and down at the end of the words, so however serious he was trying to sound, you could imagine him asking you to buy him an ice cream at any second. I'll tell you what the voice was saying, or at least as much of it as I can remember. I'll fill in the blanks myself. Call it creative writing. 90. No, of course not. Of course we won't. We don't want another war. We've got enough enemies already. We don't want to... No, that's not what I'm saying. We don't want to end the treaty completely. Really. We just want to change a couple of the clauses. That's all. Listen, it's in your favor. All I'm saying is... No, listen. All I'm saying is that we're ready to change the bits about you not being allowed to have time technology. That's all. Yeah, I know. But look, we always sound like we're up to something. It's not like that. We're scared, you know? We need all the friends we can get, and well, the way we see it, if your people get time active, that makes you stronger. That's what we're talking about here. Making your people stronger. No, I'm not saying that. We don't want you to get involved in any military action or anything. All we're saying is we'll let you have time tech, but if we get into some kind of face-off, then you won't side against us. I mean, you won't have to side with us, just as long as you don't make any deals with anyone we might be at war with. Trust me, we're going to make the offer in a couple of days. I mean, officially. I'm telling you now because I thought you should know how things are going. That's all. Right? 91. None of this will mean anything to you yet. It all comes together in the end, though. Wait and see. 92 to 94. It was in the living room of the flat, and it was big. You could tell it must have cost a fortune to rent the place. The ceiling was higher than any ceiling in London had the right to be, and the whole of the far wall was made up of windows, so you could see several miles worth of tower blocks and back streets whichever way you looked. Soho. Definitely Soho. There was sunlight. Plenty of it. Shining through the rain clouds. Any minute now, the sky was saying. Any minute now, it'll piss down. And lighting up the old wooden floorboards. Just about everything in the room was made of wood. There weren't any chairs, just a handful of wooden bunk beds pushed against some of the walls, as if someone who decorated the place was still enough of a kid to think that bunk beds were a really smart idea, and had furnished the whole of his living space with them, even though he knew hardly any of them would ever get used. There was a color TV opposite the door, against the big bright windows, stuck inside a fake wooden cabinet. The furnishings were pretty new, you could tell. You could still smell the packaging material on them. And then there were the ships. Ships in bottles. Not like the Airfix kits, but proper ones. Some of them anything up to 2 feet long. Some of them anything up to 2 feet long. Things you knew must have come from antique shops. They were arranged around the walls, or nesting on the mattresses of bunks, or even hanging from the ceiling on skinny wires. A couple of the ships weren't bottled, like they'd escaped, or maybe they were just too complicated to get squeezed to glass. Some of them even had oars, like Viking ships, and some of them had engines. But even the spaceships in bottles were carved out of wood. That was it, wasn't it? That was why there was wood everywhere. Because whoever had decorated the place had wanted to feel like he was inside one of the bottles himself. From here, looking out across the city, you could almost believe that London was the world outside of the bottle. The world you'd see if you could stare out past the cork. Or maybe London was the world inside the bottle, depending on where you were standing. The first moving thing I saw was Bill Grundy, reporting live from the Labour Party conference on ITV. The sound was turned right down, so for a second I thought he was the one talking about treaties and time travel. It took me a while to take in the rest of the room and see the blonde man lying sprawled out in one of the bunks on the corner. He was the only other person in the room, but somehow he still managed to look really pleased that he'd ended up with the top bunk. He stopped talking when he saw me. There was a shocked kind of expression on his face. He was holding something dark and plasticky next to his ear, which I must have thought was a telephone, even though it didn't have a cord and wasn't connected to anything. "I'll call you back," the man said, and with that he stuffed the might-have-been a phone under the mattress of the bunk and turned back to look at me. He smiled. You could tell he was forcing it. "Hi!" he said. I looked around the room. Nobody was there to give me any clues. Even Bill Grundy didn't look like he wanted to help. "Hello," I said. "Where am I?" The blonde man opened his mouth to say something, then changed his mind and closed it again. He sat upright on the bunk, so I could see all the sinews flowing from under that blue suit of his. Yes, he was still wearing it. Dark blue jacket, dark blue trousers, white shirt. It didn't look like he'd slept in it, though. Eventually, he'd hopped down off the bunk, and there was a heavy thump when his huge, bare feet hit the floorboards. I jumped. He must have seen this because he decided against coming any closer. He said, this is where I live. I mean, I've only just moved in and everything. Just been here a few weeks," he shrugged. "Sorry. Look, this is really difficult. I know you must be feeling, and, well, we'd better start from the beginning, yeah?" "You're not the killer, are you?" I asked. God knows why I'd thought I'd get an honest answer to that. He looked embarrassed when he said it. He glanced down at his feet, but his toes just wiggled up at him. So he looked up again. I think you're getting confused." "Okay," I said. "You're right. Let's start from the beginning." He smiled again. Then, a great big baby kind of smile. That's when I noticed how old his face was. In the police station, I thought he was young. Maybe my age. Why? Because of his hair, all short and spiky, like he wanted to look exciting and dynamic. Because of that earring. But he was older than I was. At least a decade older. Even so, he still looked uncomfortable in that suit, like his body wanted to prove how young it was, by squirming out of his proper clothing and running around half naked. Half naked. Was I thinking about what he'd look like half naked, even then? No, I don't think I was. He took a step towards me, but just the one. "My name's Chris," he said. Chris Quedge, and I'm friendly." Oh, what a coincidence," I said, trying to pretend that I was at some dinner party or other. "My name's Christine Summerfield," the man said. The man who called himself Quedge said. I must have looked surprised, because he shrugged and grinned the way, as I'd later find out, he always did when he thought he said the wrong thing. "It was in the records," he told me, "at the police station." The police station. Oh yes, I decided it was probably time to face the ugly truth and ask the big question. "What the fuck is happening to me?" I asked. Chris Quedge sighed. His lungs were huge, so it took him a while to fill them up and empty them again. "That's really complicated," he said. "Look, are you hungry?" "I haven't had any breakfast, only I haven't had any breakfast yet." 95. There was a lot of embarrassment in Quedge that first day I spent with him. Even before I'd got to know him, I figured out why. He was embarrassed that I'd ended up involved in things. And he used to apologize a lot for getting me into this, for messing up my life. That's what I thought, anyways. As he told me later on, it was him who'd planted the potato thing in my leg. "Copycat tissue," he said. "Best way of healing that kind of damage. I'm sure he could have given me a proper scientific explanation, but to be honest, I couldn't have cared less about the details." One question's got to be asked, though. Quedge said he took me back to his flat because I was injured, because he didn't think he could leave me in the hands of the local authorities without them finding out too much about the winged things. We'll come to that in a minute. But the policeman, Sergeant Elliot Bishop, was hurt just as badly as I was, even though most of the damage was psychological. Why didn't Quedge take him home? Why wasn't the sergeant given some copycat tissue that could heal over the cracks in his head? Quedge never gave me an answer to that, but I came up with one pretty quickly. It was because Quedge didn't fancy Sergeant Elliot Bishop. Somewhere in every human male, and Quedge was human, at least to start with, there must be something that makes them do whatever they can to look after skinny women, but leave the wounded men for somebody else to deal with. 96. I remember this girl who used to beg for spare change outside of Tottenham Court Road Tomb Station. Cal always used to give her money, even though he never had anything for the other 60 million beggars in London. I asked him about that once. Why he gave money to only that one girl. "'Cause she's cute," he told me. That made me angry at the time. Asked him why he thought this was a fair way of deciding who should have money and who should be left to starve in the gutters, so Cal shrugged at me. "You give money to fucking save the whales," he said. "So?" I said. "You don't bother giving any money to cancer research, do you?" "So?" I said. "You do the same as me," he said. "You just give money to the causes that you like the look of." And all in all, that's what I felt like I was around Quedge. Just a cause he liked the look of. But you want to hear his explanation about why my life had suddenly turned to shit and everybody wanted to kill me? I think it's about time I got around to that. Notes on Quedge. 97. We were both still sitting on the floor of the living room, with our legs crossed, poking at identical bowls of cornflakes. Quedge had picked the cereal that came with the free plastic toy. Very into toys, Quedge. You could tell, just by looking at the living room, with all its bottled ships and model starfighters, or whatever they were called. The TV was switched on, but Quedge had turned up the sound a little. I think he wanted to give me some kind of normal background noise to make me feel more at home. I had my eyes fixed on the cornflakes, while the room filled up with the theme tune of Poggle's Wood. "I know dealing with this kind of thing is hard to deal with," Quedge said. It was hard for me as well, you know?" It was almost funny, hearing him try to be all caring and sensitive. He sounded like a 5-year-old, saying sorry for bursting someone else's balloon. His face still looked too old for his body. For the way he acted. Was that why the aliens used him as an agent, maybe? because they knew all they had to do was show him a piece of their super technology, and he'd go, "Wow, cool," and not ask any questions. How old are you? I asked. I didn't have anything better to say. Qued shrugged. He kept tapping his soggy cornflakes with his spoon like he was trying to wake them up and make them do something more interesting. I've lost track. I've been living outside of linear time for the last couple of years. I said. 98. Quedge was the kind of person who'd never throw away his old washing up liquid bottles just in case he saw Blue Peter about how to turn them into rocket ships. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. Even people with their own time machines get the urge to make things out of squeezy bottles sometimes. I'll tell you in full what Quedge told me about his employers, but there wouldn't be much point. I told you about my dream, didn't I? Well, most of it was right. That happened a lot around Quedge. I'd wake up in mornings and know stuff about his world that he'd never actually told me. I'd say he was the kind of man to make my dreams come true, but that'd be missing the point, I think. Just like in the dream, there really were planets all over space where people had crawled up out of the dirt and built things to keep themselves happy. I'm talking about people here with arms and legs and proper faces. Quedge's bosses had been around a lot longer than anyone else, so they'd got the jump on the rest of us. They'd been the first ones to come up with time travel, which made them the most powerful people in space, or at least that was what they liked to tell everybody. Yes, I know. There's a point in every acid head's life where he or she starts to think that maybe the real world isn't real. That maybe the hallucinations are the real thing, that by stuffing more tabs down his or her neck, he or she can go all the way and see what's really there behind the dirt and matter that clogs up our lives most of the time. The point when you can either call it a day and move on to something else, like, say, cocaine, or your instincts tell you and your Or you do what your instincts tell you and run away to live with the hippie machine elves in hyperspace. There in the flat, I knew I must have reached the point of no return and not even noticed it. Which is why I believed, without asking too many difficult questions, that the man called Chris Quedge really was working for a bunch of old alien wizards who thought they ran the universe. If I'd been thinking straight, I would have just told myself it was the world's biggest and stupidest practical joke ever. There's a lot to be said for not thinking straight. 99, 100. On the TV screen, the puppet people were still going through the motions of life in Poggle's Wood, scratching their heads and looking surprised while the narrator explained what was supposed to be happening to them. In the real world, I was going through pretty much the same thing. But you're human, I said. Quedge nodded. I was born on Earth, yeah. I just work for them, that's all. Them. He said them. In all the time that I knew him, I never once heard Quedge call his employers by name. He talked about houses sometimes, as if the people who had given him his orders had cliques and families and feuds of their own, but names? He never used names. I think he was scared to. Like some kind of magic trick was going to kick in if he did. Like all he had to do was say the word and they'd appear right there in the room with him, all blood and fire and thunder. Why? I asked him. Why do I work for them? Quedge looked surprised. I don't think he thought it was a decent question to ask. You mean, how did I end up getting together with them? Yes, I said. It wasn't really what I'd asked, but it was close enough. Quedge put on his serious face, which was never very easy to take seriously. I didn't have a choice. I got kidnapped. Abducted. So these employers of you, they're not nice people? No, you don't get it. He shook his head and waved his spoon around, getting wholesome flakes of wheat and corn all over the floorboards. They've got rules where they come from. Laws. You've got to have really strict laws if you've got time travel. They're not allowed to get involved in other people's cultures. They can watch, they can make notes, and they could maybe step in if there's a crisis to stop the whole galaxy blowing up sometimes, but they can't mess around with humans. Normally, it's the rules. This wasn't making a lot of sense, and I said so. They're renegades, Quedge told me. He tried to make his voice sound all dark and sinister when he said it. They're like criminals. They steal the time travel capsules, and they go on the run. He leant forward then, poking his big face over the top of the cereal packet between us. It was the last line of defense I had. They're mad, you know. Right, I said. So you were abducted by one of the worst of the renegades. One of the worst. We'd been chasing him for years. I mean, his people had been chasing him. He was kind of a mad scientist, yeah. With a stolen time machine, I said. Quedge nodded. You know what he called himself? No, I said. He called himself the Evil Renegade, with a capital E and everything. Like he wanted everyone to know he was this mad scientist, I suggested. Yeah, he used to go around the universe, kidnapping people. He'd take them on board his time ship, and then he'd do things with them. Play with their heads, make them think they were having exciting adventures. He had all these laboratories on board the ship. So this time machine, I said, was it big? Oh yeah. And that's what he did to you? Experiments and things? Quedge shuddered. No, I'm serious. He really shuddered. I think so. He must have done. I don't remember much of it. There were a couple of others on the ships while I was there. One of them came from the same place as me. She died. I had to watch her die. The renegade, he sent her out into the middle of a war, just to watch what she'd do. He was getting upset now. You could tell. She was lucky, though. Next to some. When he got fed up with us, he just left us wherever he'd liked. Anywhere in space-time, just for a laugh. Sounds like a 60s road trip, I said. He was mad, snapped Quedge. It was scary, the way he said that. It was like when you're combing a cat or a dog, and for the first while it's fine. It's enjoying the attention, but then the comb gets snagged on its testicles, and suddenly, bang, you're in trouble. Have I really just compared Quedge to an animal with snagged testicles? 101. I looked down at my bowl. Quedge looked down at his. Sorry, he said. Uh-huh, I said. It just gets to me, you know. What he did to my life, it's just... He started shrugging again. I don't want you to think that's what I'm doing to you. That's what I'm saying. Uh-huh, I said. The thing is, I got lucky in the end. My people, his people, they caught up with him. Brought me back to the home world. They were good to me, you know. They gave me a choice and everything. Either they could put me back in my own time and blank out all the memories of what he'd done, or I could stay with them. I think I did the right thing. I risked looking back up at him. But you didn't think... After what had happened, I wasn't sure how close to his testicles I could get here. You didn't think it'd be better to forget it all? Would have been a cop-out, said Quedge. 102. I wonder how much of Quedge's memory was real. But then I spent most of my life wondering how much of my memory is real, so what can you expect? His employers knew how to play around with people's memories. Quedge said they left his mind in one piece, but I can't help of thinking of the way he'd snap when I came anywhere near saying anything good about the evil renegade. Why was that? Because Quedge had really suffered? Or because the aliens had wanted to think he'd really suffered? So they could be sure he was on their side. Also, I don't believe anyone would choose a name like the Evil Renegade. It sounds silly. If that isn't a faked memory, I don't know what is. 103. 2 weeks later, I was lying under a night sky that was totally different color from any of the night skies you used to see on Earth, looking at constellations I knew I'd never remember the names of. blue grass under my head, Quedge's face next to mine, close enough for me able to feel the warm air every time he breathed out. "Tell me something," I said, trying to sound wacky just so Quedge knew I was joking with him. He was never very good with irony. "Why do aliens have funny names, Quedge?" I felt him frown, rather than seeing it. "They don't," he said, then a pause. "Do they?" "Cal used to have all these old sci-fi novels," I told him, "and the alien characters always had stupid names. It's like, on Earth, we get proper names. We got Christian names and surnames and middle names. But aliens, these one-word, four-letter names like Darf or Vrij or Gorp or something. Any idea why that is, Quedge?" He finally got the point. "Quedge is a good name," he said. "It's Polish." "So what about Keist?" I felt the frown get deeper. I don't know where Keist comes from. I don't think he's from Earth." "He's not one of your employers?" "No, just an agent." He turned his head so his lips were nearly touching my cheek. "Christine?" "Why do you call me Quedge all the time?" "Because you're an alien," I said. "I told you, aliens don't have first names." 104. In fact, Quedge was a bit sensitive about how human he was. I knew he'd been born on Earth, but his employers had given him biological advantages when he'd signed up with them. The aliens were so advanced they'd even made machines they could sew into the cells of their bodies. Things that let them time travel more easily. Things that helped them heal if they got hurt. Things that sharpened their senses. Quedge always started mumbling whenever I asked him about it, so I never found out exactly how unhuman they'd made him, although towards the end I started to get some idea of what they'd done to his body. I didn't really think his genes were very important, really. I mean, I didn't know him for long enough to think about having kids. Besides, what was the difference between shoving machines in your body so you could see in the dark and shoving chemicals in your body so you could see pretty colors? Maybe that's what really defines a culture. The way its people mess around with their own bodies. Ask anyone who's ever had a tattoo done, or anyone who's ever had an ear pierced. God, have I really written over 100 pages already? 105. Anyway, all of this was in the future. On the 28th of September, when we sat in the living room with a big fat yellow sun crawling over Soho, Quedge was still trying to explain who his people were and why they'd sent him to London. I told him I'd heard him on the phone, which confused him until he figured out I was talking about the thing he'd shoved under the bunk bed mattress. I told him I'd heard him talking about some kind of face-off. He tried to look serious again. It's a busy kind of universe out there," he said. "Look, my people are the oldest civilization, yeah? They're the most powerful race there is, because they worked out time travel first, right? My people. That's what he said. See what I mean about me not being sure how human he was? There are things that are even older, though," Quedge went on, once he saw me nodding dumbly. "Not people, not civilizations, just things." "Yeah," I said, which meant, "You mean like the thing in the cell?" Quedge waved his arms around to make sure I knew he was talking about things that were big and scary. "They're like gods, I mean, I'm not saying they are gods, but they're like gods. For all we know, they're fundamental parts of the universe, like they're parts of the universe's framework. They might have been there since the beginning of time, we don't know, but we've always assumed they'd never wake up, that they'd never show themselves. All civilizations in the universe, like my people, like the humans, like whatever, they've been growing up in the shadow of these god things. Is this making sense?" Obviously it was making sense. I was remembering the dream, where I'd seen space, made up of all the winged things, where I'd seen the people building their homes in the gaps between the spaces. The way I saw it, the gods were the only ones who shifted our bones around, the ones who were making collections out of the leftover bits and pieces. 106. Later on, I found out that things weren't as simple as Quedge had made them sound. It wasn't a two-way fight between the gods and the people, for a start. The people were split up into factions, and so were the gods. And you could never be sure who was working for who. Like a big James Bond story stretch over the whole of space. And there were 101 theories about where the gods had come from, as well, although most of the popular stories said the gods were just figments of someone's imagination. The rumors said the gods had made millions and billion the gods had been made millions and billions of years earlier by a bunch of super aliens, so powerful that even their ideas were dangerous. Still, nobody seemed to know where these super aliens had gone, or why they hadn't left behind any record of why they'd done what they'd done. The gods were there. Whatever the reason, it was one of those things you just had to deal with. Why were there gods? Well, why was there anything? Why was there gravity? Why was there a universe? 107. Come to think of it, why is there a universe? 108. Another thing I've got stuck in my rucksack is a newspaper, dated the 30th of March, 2596. I've already told you that Quedge's people weren't stuck in one time like the rest of us, so this shouldn't surprise you much. I say newspaper, although to be honest, I don't think there's any paper involved. I don't know what the thing's made of. All I know is that when you poke the little photos of the columnists with your fingers, they start talking, in case you can't be bothered reading the words. Interesting fact, at least twice I saw Quedge poking photographs in the newspapers of 1970s and scowling when they didn't talk to him, but that's beside the point. The front page story of the 2596 paper is about a planet called Della, which, like the story says, is a colony planet on the gloomy side of the Earth Empire. That's right, one day the human race leaves Earth one day and scatters its bones across for all of the universe to see. Not bad for a race that died out in 1970, but we'll deal with these paradoxes later. The point is that in March 2596, something happened to Della. Something the Earth authorities didn't know how to deal with. The reporters didn't know how to deal with it either. The story's a bit vague about what the catastrophe might have been, but one columnist calls it an infection, and the feeling is that Della's going to be off limits to human beings for a while. What actually happened to Della was this. The gods took over. It was the second planet they'd sank their teeth into, the first being a nearby planet called Tyler's Folly. Oh no. Another Earth colony nobody ever really cared about until things started going wrong. The takeover on Della upset just about everybody. It upset the Earth authorities, who wondered whether they should try launching missiles at the planet, but never got round to it. It upset Quedge, who just happened to have friends there. I asked him whether time travelers were like sailors, with a girl in every year, but he didn't know what I was talking about. Above all, it upset Quedge's employers, who hadn't been expecting the gods to show themselves like that. It made them feel a bit helpless, I think. I'll get back to the story in a moment. Right now I feel like poking the faces of columnists. Poking all of them at once, hearing them arguing and talking over each other until the ruins are full of their stupid, whining voices. It'll feel like being in a London pub again. Like being in a pub in Tottenham Court Road. 109, 110. They found something out, Quedge told me over the cornflakes. Who have? I said. My people. They've been kind of ignoring the gods for years. We always thought they weren't important. I mean, a couple of them have shown their faces every now and again, but there are just so many other hostile powers in the universe. You know, people powers. I tried to look all serious and thoughtful. Quedge folded his fingers in front of his face. We've been putting our research people on this, finding out what the gods are, where they really come from, that kind of thing, just in case they spread, in case they're a major threat. And are they? I asked. Said Quedge. The truth is he didn't know. I didn't figure that out until later. Quedge's employers had found something out from their research, something crucial about the gods, but they'd never bothered telling Quedge what it was. Actually, we never did find out what it was, although I can make a few guesses. I know it must have been something bad, something about the gods' powers that got the time travelers on edge. Quedge's employers always thought they had a chance of fighting the gods, if it ever came to that. I think they must have worked out that they couldn't. They were scared. That's what I'm saying. And at the end of the day, that's the reason they sent Quedge to Earth. All right, I said. I'm going to see if I've got my head round this. First off, your employers are worried about the gods. Quedge opened his mouth to say something. I didn't let him. Let me finish, I said. Please. Your employers are worried about the gods, because the gods are trying to take over the universe or something, 500 or 600 years in the future. So they've sent you back to time in 1970. They want you to change time or something like that. They want you to get rid of the gods now, so they won't be a problem in the future. That thing in the police cell was one of the gods. It followed you back here to stop you, but you killed it off somehow, after I blacked out. Which is lucky, because it's been going around London killing people, right? Quedge looked a little worried. Are you sure you're feeling okay? Fine. Am I right? He cleared his throat, and he started counting off the points on his fingers. Well, to start, I haven't been sent back in time. It's not that simple. Simple, I muttered. Also, you can't change time. It doesn't work. The whole universe falls apart if you try, I think. That's not why I'm here. 3. The thing in the cell wasn't a god. It was just a sphinx. Gods are bigger. 4. I didn't kill it, I just shut it down. Okay, I said. But apart from that, how did I do? I don't know, said Quedge. I've lost track. 111. I don't remember all the details about the conversation, obviously. Writing it all out now, I'm probably filling in more details than were really there. Quedge didn't give me all the answers, not at once. The truth was, there were things he didn't like to talk about. For example, stuck in that scrapbook I keep mentioning, there's a letter, dated September 1970, and written, in ugly, scrawling kind of handwriting, on a notepad headed with the name of a prison in Los Angeles. It's an answer to a question Quedge had asked earlier, asked the writer a couple of weeks earlier. The writer tells Quedge that yes, he does think the fall of civilization is imminent, except that he doesn't use the word imminent, and he spelt civilization with a Z. There's a time of reckoning when all the pigs and... Larry, I can't say this word. When all the pigs and N-words will wipe each other out in a war of blood and fire. While all this was going on, the lucky few are going to be hiding out somewhere underground, ready to build the new, white, police-free utopia once the bloodshed is over. I don't know how Quedge managed to get in touch with the letter writer, although I suppose anything's possible if you're working with aliens. But I do know why Quedge asked the question in the first place. It was because he wanted to understand. He wanted to know about Earth, and about all the things we thought were going to happen to it. Quedge must have decided that the writer was the right kind of person to ask, even if he was a complete paranoid maniac. The writer, that is, not Quedge. The letter isn't signed, although it's pretty obvious who wrote it, and it's easy to see why Quedge didn't like to talk about it, why he didn't want me to know exactly who his friends were. Scared to talk too much. That was Quedge. Notes on the bottle. 112. Ancient Egypt was always popular with Lady Diamond's customers. Let's face it, the perfect civilization. Old enough for Lady to pretend the Egyptians had passed down all kinds of lost secrets to fortune-tellers, but big enough to have left a bunch of bloody great pyramids behind. As far as Lady was concerned, the reason they'd built the pyramids was so people like her could use them as props thousands of years later. There's a whole city in Egypt that used to belong to the priests, Lady Diamond once told me in the days before she'd figured out I wasn't going to be impressed. A whole walled-off city, and no one ever found out what they did in there. Orgies, they said. Sex magic. Can you just imagine? Have you been there? I asked. Darling, of course I've been there, said Lady Diamond, the woman who'd also claimed she had been in the bedrooms of every male rock and roll star who'd had a top 10 hit between 1963 and 1968. There are dirty pictures all over the walls. There's something they don't show you in the Natural History Museum. The Egyptians invented mathematics, you know. I didn't see what that had to do with orgies or dirty pictures. Besides, it sounded like she made it up. I nodded anyways. It was all about geometry, Lady went on. The priests knew they could get in touch with their gods through the powers of mathematics. That's why they made so many great buildings. All those straight lines and angles. That's where the Masons get their ideas from. She tapped the side of her nose, like she wanted me to think she'd been having sex with the Masons for most of her adult life. Oh, I said. They used to sacrifice slaves to their buildings. They used to use their crushed-up bodies as mortar. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Mainly because Lady had got the idea from watching the 10 Commandments. I mean, you can just imagine, darling, Lady told me, the things they must have found out, locked away in that city of theirs. The kinds of things they must have built. What kinds of devices must have been there, What kind of diabolical engines fed by the blood of their followers? They didn't have engines, did they? I asked. Although if she'd said that the first steam train had been had been invented by Tutankhamun, I probably would have just shrugged. 113, 114. By 2 o'clock on the 28th of September, 1970, I was standing in the kitchen of Chris Quedge's flat, scraping my leftover cornflakes into a plastic pedal bin. I felt like I hadn't eaten properly since the day I'd been born, but somehow my mouth didn't feel up to chewing. It was a sphinx, Quedge said, at long last. He decided to tell me all about the thing I'd seen in the police cell. They're like the god's servants, we think. The kitchen was tiny. Hardly big enough for 2 people. There was no fake wood paneling here, just smooth, shiny white surfaces, tiles that had been splashed with juice of old tea bags. You could tell it was a man who owned the flat. Nobody had even tried to decorate the room. The forks and spoons were lying in a messy heap by the sink, and under the bare light bulbs, there weren't any windows, you could see every blob of grease on every piece of metal. Quedge stood in the doorway, with his big, lanky body leaning against the frame. He'd scooped up a jar of peanut butter from a sideboard, and now he was busy running his finger around the rim. Sphinx as in Egypt? I asked. Not really. People call them sphinxes because it kind of fits them. We've known about them for years. I thought you said the gods had only just woken up. The thing is, said Quedge. Then he stopped and sucked the peanut butter off his hands. The thing is, the gods aren't all the same, he went on. They fight with each other, just like we do. We think they've got different agendas. Most of the gods have been asleep for the past few million years, but there have been sightings. We think a few of them have been slumming out around the universe, exploring, finding stuff out about other races. Like your evil renegade did, I said. Quedge immediately stopped slapping his tongue around his gums. I suppose so, he said. Della. That's the planet I was talking about. The one the gods took over. That's not... No, that isn't. Della. That's the one planet I was talking about. The one the gods took over. It wasn't the first place the gods had popped up on. There's another planet. On the edge of the galaxy. The other edge from Earth, I mean. It's kind of been a colony for the gods for as long as anyone can remember. When we think it belongs to one of them. To one of the rogue gods, I mean. This is guesswork, seeing as nobody's ever been there and come back again. We're not even sure it's a planet. How can you can tell whether something's a planet or not? I asked. Quedge looked doubtful. You can't tell whether something's a planet or not? I asked. Quedge looked doubtful. Space goes funny around the gods, he said. The usual laws don't work properly. Listen, you said something about Egypt, right? Do you know anything about old Egyptian priests? I said. 115. Bear with me here. We're getting close to the part of the story where I tell you the secret of the universe. 116. I could write a whole thesis now about the biology of the sphinxes. Most of it would probably still be wrong, mind you, but it'd still be a thesis. One of the things you've got to remember is sphinxes aren't natural. They didn't evolve. I mean, just look at the things. Big sharp wings, bones that move around under their skin so you can tell whether they're supposed to walk on 2 legs or 4 legs. The great bloody TV screens popping out of their faces. They look like TV screens anyways, although I suppose they're just lenses. Maybe to help them focus on what they're doing. The gods made the sphinxes for a reason. They're not like slaves. They're tools. Because sphinxes can make space. I've read the books, all the theories written down by Quedge's employers. Sphinxes feed on stuff from outside normal time-space, although apparently you have to have eyes that see in 5 dimensions to guess what this stuff might actually look like. The important thing is the sphinxes eat material from outside the ordinary universe, then excrete it, again, as raw space-time. I'll never, as long as I live, forget the way Chris Quedge described this process to me. They poo reality, basically, he said. That was why Quedge's employers couldn't even be sure whether the part of space owned by the renegade gods was a planet. Because the gods had been adding to it for thousands of years, getting their sphinxes to make more space in the area. Almost like they were building their own little microcosm universe on the edge of the real one. The sphinxes had been there for thousands of years, beavering away like nobody's business, stopping only to kill off any travelers stupid enough to get close to their territory. 117. Microcosm. I've decided to make that the word of the day, mainly because I just flipped through my dictionary to check the spelling, and by pure chance, I ended up opening to the exact page that starts with, ta-da, microcosm. Just luck, really. But it happens a lot. Quedge once said that it's because all dictionaries are a bit telepathic, although he could have been joking. He was the one who bought me this dictionary, by the way. It's a 26th century edition, packed with all the latest words from far-off corners of the Earth Empire, and it's about the same size as a Mars bar, with the letters so small you need a special mini-computer to read them. On the day Quedge bought it for me, the first word I saw after a random page flip was fake. Just bear that in mind when you read the next few pages. That's all. 118. Listen, you said you know something about Egypt, right? Do you know anything about old Egyptian priests? Ah, I said. I didn't know whether to mention that what Lady Diamond had told me, seeing as I knew she'd made most of it up. They were more than just priests. Quedge said, they were like masons, mechanics. They built engines, I said, fed by the blood of their followers. Quedge blinked at me. Really? He said. He sounded impressed. Never mind, I said. Carry on. Quedge put the peanut butter back on the sideboard, though he didn't bother screwing the tap back on. I did that for him, without thinking. What I'm saying is, that's what the gods' followers are like. That's what we've heard from Della, anyway. We think it's probably the same in the part of space where the renegade gods live. We think they've got human worshippers there. We think the humans are the ones who look after the sphinxes. They use the sphinxes to build things for the gods. Like I said, masons. That made sense to me. The worshippers were doing what the rest of us do all the time, building things to keep the gods happy and telling themselves they were doing something important and noble. Can you imagine, I said, trying to remember what Lady Diamond asked me, the things they must have built? Yeah, said Quedge, that's it. That's the problem. 119, 120. And now a story. Are you sitting comfortably, children? Then I'll begin. Once upon a time, there was an alien called the Evil Renegade, who used to kidnap people and carry them off through time just to see what would happen. The Evil Renegade was proud of his reputation as a reckless, dangerous adventurer who'd run away from his people and was quite happy to spend his whole life running. To prove to everyone how fearless he was, he challenged just about every other race in the universe and never lost, because he was such a mastermind criminal, because he was as much a criminal mastermind as he was a mad scientist. But there was one kind of monster the evil renegade hadn't ever taken on, and that annoyed him. He'd never gone head to head with the gods, so one day the evil renegade decided to do something about it. Along with his human slaves, the evil renegade took his time machine to the place where the Sphinxes lived, the world that the runaway gods had been building for themselves on the edge of the galaxy. Nobody else has ever come back from Sphinx space alive, so it'd be hard to say what happened to the renegade in the gods' world. There are stories, although nobody's sure where the stories come from. All the rumors say it was a big fight, with the evil renegade waging a one-man war against the gods just for the hell of it. The cities where the gods' worshippers lived were wrecked. The gods themselves were injured, and their blood rained down over whole countries. Astronomers, watching the homes of the gods from 1 billion miles away, sat and stared while a hole of Sphinx face lit up with fire. By the way, you should hear Quedge tell this story. He somehow manages to squeeze in a couple of dozen spaceship battles along the way. Believe me, this is the edited version you're getting. In the end, the evil renegade was beaten. The gods were too strong even for him, so he made his escape while he could, leaving his doomed human slaves behind and getting away in his time machine. But he didn't go empty-handed. He stole something from the rogue gods, one of the devices their worshippers had built in their honor. The evil renegade had spirited away and hoarded it in his trophy room, along with all the other things he'd taken from the worlds he'd visited, all the stolen relics and severed heads of his enemies. The thing he stole was a bottle, a very special kind of bottle that had been built by the Sphinxes, working to the plans of the gods' followers. And the bottle stayed on the renegade's time machine for years, until finally the renegade's own people caught up with him, and the relic ended up in the hands of Chris Quedge. I've seen that bottle, of course. I saw it not long after the conversation in the kitchen. It was sitting on a velvet cushion, being treated like the king of the world by Quedge's people. I remember seeing it for the first time, looking through the glass and gawping at what was inside. There's no way of saying how it feels to see something like that in front of you. To see whole star systems spinning around inside a bottle not much bigger than a foot long. To see all these galaxies squeezed into a space about the same size as your own hand. It's true, I remember saying. It's fucking true. Sorry, Quedge mumbled. A whole universe, I said. Behind me, I heard Keast, who I haven't told you about yet, but we'll get there, don't worry, snorting to himself under his breath, like he thought I was too stupid and primitive to understand anything that important. A whole universe, Quedge agreed. In a bottle. 122. A whole universe, said Quedge, some time before that. In a bottle. We were still in the kitchen of his flat, and I was putting the milk back in the fridge on the grounds that Quedge probably wasn't going to bother. I was starting to feel itchy, like my body didn't think it could take any more of this without chemical help. You're kidding, I said. The Sphinxes can do that? They can just build something that big and just... Yeah, said Quez. Cosmic, isn't it? I got the feeling he only said cosmic because he'd heard the hippies saying it. But it's not a real universe. But it's not a real universe, I said. Not like this one, I mean. It's like a model universe, yeah? Quedge frowned. Then he looked down at his feet. They were still bare, and they weren't giving him any answers. Hard to say, he said. Are there people in it? Living inside the bottle? Yes. Do they know, though? Do they know they're not real? Quedge was still toe-staring. I didn't say they weren't real. They were just made by the Sphinxes, that's all. I didn't argue. Don't the gods want it back? I should think so, said Quedge, looking up at last. I think that's why the Sphinxes are following me. You mean you've got it in here? I said. You brought this universe in a bottle thing with you to London in 1970? Not exactly, said Quedge. Look, I haven't made the report to the homeworld yet. I'm not sure I should be telling you everything this so soon. A few more memories, which may be real, or may just be things I'm imagined after the fact. 1. It was something I'd thought of while I was running away from Lady Diamond's shop with the wound in my leg, when I'd first worked out, or just imagined, that there were things moving around in the shadows, shifting our bones into patterns even the priests of Egypt would have been proud of. I'd imagined that these were monsters, whatever they were. These monsters, whatever they were, had been changing space so we all had enough room to die in. Was that a premonition or what? 2. The corridors of the police station had gone on forever. Earlier on, I'd put it down to the pain and the coke. Looking back on it, it's easy to imagine that a sphinx had shat out raw space-time and that it had gone through the station, stretching out the corridors behind it. Does that make sense? 3. A definite, dubious memory, this. Think about the man who attacked me in Lady Diamond's shop. The man who, by now, I knew had been a sphinx, somehow disguised as a human being, by changing its own private body space, maybe? Sometimes I remember turning around and seeing him already standing there in the doorway, staring at me. Sometimes I remember it another way. I remember him stepping out of the shadows. I mean literally, stepping out of the shadows, moving out of the spaces in the building that shouldn't have been there. Did I really see him stroke it doing that? Or am I fantasizing again? 124. Not long now until the secret of the universe. Hold your breath. 125, 126. Quedge led me out into the hallway of the flat. I thought we were going back into the living room, but instead he just stood there with his back against the wall, sticking his hands into the pockets of his suit as if he didn't know what else to do with them. There were still 3 or 4 doors in the hallway I hadn't been through, although I guess that most of them led to spare rooms. One of the doors had a big padlock fixed to the handle, which I thought was odd. Mysterious, locked rooms. How gothic. What horrors could have been waiting for me on the other side? Well, that's not important right now. My people are scared, Quedge said. He practically whispered it, so I started thinking about conversations in spy movies, wondering if we were standing in the hall only because of the rest of the flat was bugged. Scared? I repeated. You mean of the gods? Quedge nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on the grubby floorboards. So there's going to be a war? I asked. I couldn't even imagine what a war on that scale might be like, although I guess there'd be a lot more than just spaceships shooting at each other. No, said Quedge. My employers, they know they're outgunned. They know they can't beat the gods. I don't know how they know it, but they know. Then he sighed and lifted up his head, letting it thunk back against the wall. Stupid. Really, really stupid. We always thought we were the best, tougher than anybody else, smarter. I never thought I'd see them scared. Note the way Quedge swung between us and them when he was talking about his employers, like he wasn't sure whether he qualified as one of them or just one of their servants. Personally, I didn't know what to say, so I just shuffled my feet. The gods don't just take over planets, Quedge said. They take over whole cultures. You know what that's like for my people? Their culture's the oldest there is. I think so, anyways. They don't want to lose that. We don't want to lose that. We have to make sure the gods don't take it from us. We've got to make sure there's something left, even if the gods take over. Something left of the homeworld. You mean your new homeworld, I said. Where your employers come from, yeah? Quedge looked at me, at last. His eyes were shiny, little blue buttons. We're going to send some of our people inside the bottle, said Quedge. That's what this is about. We're going to put together a survival team, just a few of my people. They're going to take all our secrets, all our technology, and they're going to set up new lives for themselves inside the bottle world. That way our culture's going to be able to live, even if most of us get taken over by the gods. There'll be a kind of colony, like a time capsule, inside the model universe. I don't get it, I said. Your people can go anywhere in space, can't they? Anywhere. So they can't just find a new planet for yourselves? Quedge shook his head. You don't understand. The gods aren't just threatening us. They're threatening everything. All of space. All of time. It doesn't matter where we go. The obvious question finally struck me. Wait a minute. Does that mean they're going to take over Earth as well? Quedge didn't give me a yes or no answer, which annoyed me. Nowhere's safe. That's what I'm saying. Nowhere real, anyways. But the bottle's different. The model universe isn't a perfect copy of the real one. It's a lot simpler. There aren't any gods there. There aren't really any high-tech cultures. There's a version of Earth, but there isn't a version of the homeworld. No time travelers. It's supposed to be safe. That's the theory, anyways. We hide our team inside the bottle, then hope the gods never think of looking there, even if they manage to find the bottle again. There was something I didn't like about the way he said that. Something about there being a version of Earth inside the bottle, so I started wondering, is there a little model version of me in there? Or isn't the detail that good? Getting into the bottle's not easy, Quedge went on. He was droning now, like he didn't want to have to tell me this. Our people spent years trying to work out how to get in and out without the two universes leaking, and in the end we had to copy the Sphinxes. We had to copy their rituals, and even then we could only get one person inside the bottle. Who volunteered? I said. I did, said Quedge. I've got to admit, I was impressed. You've been inside the bottle? That was the plan, Quedge told me. For me to get into the bottle world, to find a decent planet, to find a decent time period, somewhere our people could blend in. Then I was supposed to open up the bottle from the inside, so the rest of the survival team could make it through. And did you? I asked. Not yet, said Quedge. 127. And that was it? The exact moment when everything clicked together, what Quedge was really doing in London, and what he'd meant when he said he hadn't exactly that he hadn't exactly traveled through time to get here, even though he came from the 26th century. The secret of the universe. The secret of my universe, anyway. Oh, Christ, I said. Quedge just stood there, wiggling his toes. Oh, Christ, no, I said. 128. And I've just reached the end of this notebook. Anyone would think I'd planned it that way. And that concludes tonight's session. 4 hours is pretty good for a stream, I think. We had a few people come and go. I know that there were people who were directly related to the production of Dead Romance we're going to be doing. It's been a while since I've read Dead Romance, so this has been very fun for me to redo. But it's what? It's almost 1 a.m. I'm going to let you all go. Thank you all for joining me for these dark midnight hours. It's always a pleasure to read. And I hope that I'm helping some people sleep. I hope that my dulcet tones are helping you pass out for the night. But I bid you good night and good night.